Dennis and Brenda Bowman were a married couple with 2 children from Holland, Michigan in 1989. They lived on the corner of Lincoln Road and 52nd Street. Dennis worked as a wood machinist and Brenda used to work at the jewelry counter at the Meyer department store. Their 2 children were Andrea and Vanessa Bowman. Andrea was born on June 23 of 1974 as Alexis Badger. Her biological parents are Kathy Turkanian and Randy Badger. Before her first birthday, she was adopted by Dennis and Brenda Bowman and renamed. Vanessa was born in January of 1988. Andrea went from being an only child to more than a big sister. She was a third parent to the chubby red-headed baby. While other kids her age went to after-school clubs and Friday night football games, Andrea stayed home changing diapers and cleaning bottles. On March 11th of 1989, Dennis Bowman contacted police. He told them that he had come home from his job to find 14-year-old Andrea missing. Dennis said that some of Andrea's belongings along with $100 from his dresser was also missing. He told police that Andrea was a troubled teenager who frequently fought with her mother and had run away to a friend's house once before. With no foul play suspected, the police labeled Andrea a runaway and passed her case along to the Youth Services Bureau. Few people who knew the Bowmans questioned the official narrative. Over the years, there had been whispers about the family. Once, when Andrea was in middle school, she boarded the school bus bleeding from her wrist. Some kids gossiped that she attempted to take her own life, but others said Andrea had cut herself trying to get back into her house after her parents locked her out. There were rumors that Dennis, a former Navy reservist with reddish-brown hair, a goatee, and wire-rimmed glasses, and Brenda, a portly woman with curled bangs, abused Andrea. But back then, what happened behind closed doors was considered family business. Many people in Holland assumed that Andrea had gotten so fed up with her home that she finally split. Maybe she'd gone looking for her birth mother. People heard that she'd hitched a ride to a local truck stop and had left town with an older boy or was pregnant. Brenda reported a series of tips in the weeks and months following her daughter's disappearance, all of which seemed to confirm that Andrea had run away. A single photograph formed most people's memory of her. It was given to the police when she first vanished. In it, Andrea is sitting against a blue studio backdrop and looking just off camera, with her green eyes cast upward. Photos of missing children were often printed on the sides of milk cartons or on flyers taped to the top of pizza delivery boxes. Andrea's picture wound up somewhere else. In 1993, the band Soul Asylum debuted a music video for its song Runaway Train, featuring the images and names of missing kids across America. The video was a huge hit with several versions airing on MTV and VH1. In the one that played in Michigan, Andrea's photo appears just after the 2-minute mark. Reflecting on the video 20 years after its release, director Tony Kaye claimed that more than 24 missing children were found because of the video. Unfortunately, Andrea Bowman wasn't one of them, and her case went cold. The next major update in Andrea's case would come in 2010 when Carl Koppelman stepped in. Carl took an interest in true crime, which led him to Web Sleuths. It is a forum where crime hobbyists and armchair detectives connect and collaborate on unsolved cases. Spent countless hours scrolling through the national database of missing persons and unidentified bodies known as NAMAs. There is an overlap between the 2 main parts of the database, the disappeared and the deceased. Carl tried to match the characteristics of people who had gone missing with those of unidentified remains found. When Carl noticed that the age and condition of some of the bodies might make it difficult for loved ones to recognize them, it sparked an idea. He started creating lifelike renderings of Jane and John Does based on photos taken post-mortem. Some of the solved cases that we've covered on this channel before have been solved because of these renderings. Once he finished a rendering, Carl sent it to NIMUSE, and the database would sometimes publish it. He also posted his work on Web Sleuths so other armchair detectives could use it in their identification efforts. Eventually, Carl began working with police departments and the DNA Doe Project, which identifies human remains through genetic testing and genealogical research. Carl got interested in the case of the Racine County Jane Doe. She was found near the edge of a Wisconsin cornfield in 1999. She had been not alive for about 12 hours, but rain washed away any evidence that might have been useful to investigators. It seemed likely that the young woman's life was taken elsewhere and dumped. An autopsy determined that she may have been cognitively disabled and that she had suffered long-term abuse and neglect. She had broken bones and a cauliflower ear, and her body showed signs that she was assaulted. More than 50 people from the farming community where she was found attended her funeral. She was found wearing a men's gray and silver Western-style shirt embroidered with red flowers. On Namas, Carl plugged in some general search criteria, gender, age, location, and clicked through the results for missing persons. In most cases, the answer was a clear no. The age didn't match or the location made no sense. But one entry gave Carl hope: Andrea Bowman. Andrea and the Racine County Jane Doe shared physical characteristics and their ages aligned. Andrea would have been 25 in 1999 when the Jane Doe's life was taken. Holland, where Andrea disappeared, sits directly across Lake Michigan from where the Jane Doe was found. It's just 4 hours by car from one location to the other. Carl took his theory to law enforcement, who found it compelling enough to actually investigate. To determine whether the Jane Doe was Andrea, police would need to compare DNA from the body with that of someone in Andrea's family. Because Andrea was adopted, authorities had to track down her birth mother, which took a while. Andrea's birth mother is Kathy Turkanian. In 1972, at the age of 14, she ran away from her family. Kathy left Virginia, where they lived, and hitchhiked to Memphis, Tennessee, and she had no money. Kathy met 19-year-old Randy Badger. In December of 1972, Kathy and Randy traveled to South Carolina, where it was legal for a minor to get married if they had parental permission. Kathy's parents gave it gladly because they did not want to be responsible for her at all. The couple were married less than a year when Kathy found out she was pregnant. On June 23 of 1974, Kathy gave birth to a healthy daughter. She named her Alexis. When Alexis was 5 months old, Kathy and Randy separated and she went back to live with her parents in Virginia. Kathy realized she was going to receive no help from her family and couldn't give Alexis the life that she wanted to. Alexis was put up for adoption and was soon adopted by Dennis and Brenda Bowman. In April of 2010, police working on Andrea's case sent a letter to Kathy Turkanian's home. The letter explained that Andrea disappeared from her adoptive home and that she might be a Jane Doe found in Wisconsin. Police needed a sample of Kathy's DNA to know for sure. Kathy was willing to share her DNA, but she wanted to know more about what had happened to her daughter. In the letter, it gave no details, and Kathy didn't even know that her name was changed to Andrea Bowman. She searched online for information about missing girls in Michigan. It didn't take long to find one from the town of Holland whose birthday and physical description matched Alexis's. When she saw the girl's school photo, Kathy thought Andrea Bowman could be her daughter. In her quest to find out more about Andrea, she connected with Carl Koppelman. While waiting for the DNA test results, Kathy also got in touch with a retired Michigan detective named Pat O'Reilly. Pat told Kathy that Andrea's adoptive father, Dennis Bowman, was responsible for her disappearance. Let's take a deeper look at Dennis and other crimes he committed. In May of 1980, a 19-year-old woman was riding her bike north of Holland, Michigan, when a motorcyclist forced her off the road. The man told her to get off her bike and walk into the woods. The young woman didn't move. The man pulled out a gun, fired a shot past her, and repeated the order. Still, she didn't budge. The man fired the gun again, this time at the ground near her feet. He said he would shoot her next. Just then, a car drove by and the motorcyclist turned his head towards the noise, and the young woman took the opportunity to pedal away as fast as she could. The man didn't shoot or give chase, and she was able to flag down someone in a pickup truck who drove her home. Her parents called the police, and the young woman provided a description of the suspect. A white male with tinted glasses and a blue helmet. His motorcycle, she said, had a blacktop case mounted on the back. By the end of the day, the police had detained a suspect. The young woman took one look at him and confirmed that he was the man who tried to attack her. It was Dennis Bowman, who by then was already a husband and a father. At the time, Andrea was almost 6 years old. Dennis was convicted of assault with intent to commit criminal conduct and sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison. He was referred for psychological counseling, and a judge determined that he would likely pose a danger to women if he was free. Still, Dennis served the minimum sentence. One day in 1998, a state trooper in Dorr, Michigan responded to an alarm at the mobile home of 28-year-old Vicki Vandenbrink. She'd reported so many break-ins that the sheriff's department had installed a security system. When the trooper arrived at the scene, he found Dennis Bowman walking away from the back door. The Bowmans had moved to Hamilton, a town nestled between Holland and Dorr. In 1989, shortly after Andrea's disappearance, Dennis told the officer he was temporarily staying with Vicki Vandenbrink, who was a former co-worker of his. He was let go, but when authorities got in touch with Vicki, who wasn't home when the alarm went off, she said Dennis was lying. Dennis then changed his story, telling law enforcement that he'd entered the trailer to use the bathroom. He'd been there at least once before, he claimed, when his daughter Vanessa wanted to sell Girl Scout cookies to Vicki. Skeptical, the police obtained Dennis's permission to search his property. In the loft of an outbuilding, they found a black duffel bag containing lingerie that was later identified as Vicki Vandenbrink's, as well as a short-barreled shotgun, a black sweatshirt, and a mask. Kathy Turkanian learned the details of Dennis Bowman's criminal record after submitting a Freedom of Information Act request based on what Detective Pat O'Reilly had told her. After seeing what he did to other women, Kathy became convinced that Dennis Bowman took Andrea's life. If Kathy was right, it would mean that the Racine County Jane Doe wasn't Andrea. That theory made sense only if Andrea was still alive 10 years after she disappeared. In 2013, the long-awaited DNA results confirmed it. Kathy was not related to the Jane Doe. In September of 2013, Kathy and Carl met in person at the Missing in Michigan conference. Organized by the state police, the conference was designed to raise awareness about and hopefully generate leads for cold cases. Kathy and Carl showed up in custom shirts they made that read, "Find Andrea Bowman." Carl scanned the room and was surprised when his eyes landed on familiar faces. He nudged Kathy and she looked over. "That's Vanessa," she said, "and that's Brenda." Brenda recognized Kathy because she saw that Kathy said on Facebook that she believes Dennis is responsible. Brenda seemed eager to explain her side of the story. She insisted that she and Dennis had fully cooperated with police after Andrea's disappearance. She presented a binder full of notes and missing persons flyers as proof. She recounted sightings of Andrea. It was clear she still believed that the teenager had run away. According to Carl, when he brought up Dennis' criminal record, Brenda replied, "Haven't forgotten what he did, but I do forgive him. I take my marriage vows very seriously." After the conference, Kathy hired a private investigator named Jeffrey Floor. He managed to get his hands on Andrea's police file, which Kathy and Carl had never seen. Oddly, the earliest documents in it were from March of 1989 when Andrea disappeared. They were dated 4 months earlier. That was when police responded to allegations of abuse in the Bowman home. The report did not go into detail about what happened, noting only that local authorities had determined that the allegations were not true. Carl and Kathy were sure that law enforcement had missed something. In 2017, Kathy and Carl met up with Chris Haverdink, the detective who'd taken over Andrea's case. Haverdink agreed that Bowman was suspicious, but that wasn't enough to arrest him. On November 22nd of 2019, Dennis Bowman was arrested by the Allegan County Sheriff's Office, but not because of anything to do with Andrea. He'd been arrested in relation to a crime committed 9 years before Andrea disappeared, more than 800 miles away from the shores of Lake Michigan. Bowman was arrested because he apparently took the life of Kathleen Doyle in 1980. 25-year-old Kathleen had been stripped gagged, strangled with an electrical cord, then assaulted and stabbed. Investigators collected male DNA from her body, but had few leads until Henry Lee Lucas was arrested in 1983. Lucas claimed that he and a partner named Otis Toole were responsible. His confessions were later revealed to be false and the charges were dropped. Eventually, science caught up with the case. Genetic genealogy, which compares unidentified DNA with a huge number of samples stored in databases, was becoming a very popular way of investigating these cold cases. Norfolk investigators partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a leader in the field, to test the DNA collected at Kathleen's crime scene. Soon, based on genealogical research, they had a list of more than 30 suspects. In 2019, after some more testing and police work, it led investigators to Dennis Bowman. Bowman was extradited to Virginia to stand trial. By then, he had already confessed. He admitted to entering Kathleen Doyle's home through a back window. He claimed that he was drunk and that it was an attempted robbery. He said he didn't expect to find Kathleen in the house and that he didn't plan to take her life. But she was in the house and he did take her life. At the time, Bowman was in Norfolk for his annual 2-week service in the Navy Reserve. He was also out of jail on bond. He was awaiting trial for the attempted assault of the 19-year-old Holland woman, the one he fired a gun at before she escaped on her bike. Kathy learned that she'd inadvertently played a role in solving Kathleen Doyle's case. Jeffrey Floor, a private detective, told her that at some point the Bowmans had visited the Allegan County Sheriff's Office to report Kathy for harassment. They claimed she was making defamatory accusations about Dennis online. Investigators offered Dennis a bottle of water and kept it when he left. According to Floor, that was how his DNA came into their possession. In the first week of February of 2020, with a thick layer of snow blanketing the ground, police returned to the Bowmans' property. There was a forensics team on site this time with a crime scene tent and dogs in the backyard. Officials appeared to be concentrating on one area in particular and they had started to dig. Later that day, the police held a press conference. They announced that human skeletal remains had been found and that they likely belonged to Andrea Bowman. The police needed to confirm that it was in fact Andrea. Kathy provided her DNA immediately. In March of 2020, almost 31 years to the day after Andrea disappeared, the results came back. There was a DNA match. Dennis claimed that what happened to Andrea was an accident. He said that they were arguing and he slapped her, causing her to fall and break her neck. He reported her missing to cover it up. That was the story that he told Brenda in correspondence from prison. In June of 2020, Dennis received 2 life sentences plus 20 years for taking the life of Kathleen Doyle. He was legally ordered to serve his time in Michigan where he would stand trial for what he did to Andrea. The first hearing was held in February of 2021. Brenda took the stand first. She tearfully recounted how she'd made missing persons posters because she really believed that Andrea had run away. She said she learned the truth only after Dennis was arrested in the Kathleen Doyle case. When she was asked whether Andrea had ever accused Dennis of abusing her, Brenda said yes, but that she didn't believe the allegations were true. That's a lie, she told Andrea, and you know it. It was Brenda who told police where to find Andrea's remains. In a call from prison, Dennis had confessed to burying their daughter in the backyard. Brenda said she didn't believe him at first. They hadn't lived in their house in Hamilton when Andrea's life was taken, so how could he have buried her there? To Brenda's horror, Dennis explained that he'd moved their daughter's body to the new property as soon as they signed papers for it. The cement slab in the yard was the headstone of a grave that Brenda never even knew was there, in the shadow of the house she and Dennis shared for nearly 30 years. He didn't lie this time. Brenda told the detective when Andrea's remains were found. He didn't lie. As other witnesses took the stand, Dennis sat quietly in a green shirt, bow tie, and face mask. On December 22, 2021, Bowman pleaded no contest. He was sentenced to an additional 35 to 50 years in prison for taking Andrea Bowman's life. Bowman confessed to an assault from 1979. The crime was featured on the front page in the Holland Sentinel published October 18, 1979. The article detailed a very violent attack on a 27-year-old woman who early on a Sunday morning was bound, gagged, and assaulted by an intruder in her home. The perpetrator took cash before fleeing the scene and was described as a white man between 25 and 30 years old with sandy hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He was estimated at 5 feet 6 inches, 150 pounds, and according to the young woman, her assailant was wearing a leather jacket and dark pants. The newspaper published a police sketch of the suspect, his ink-blotted pupils staring blankly from the front page. According to the lead detective in the case, there had been a recent uptick in reports of prowlers in the neighborhood where the crime had occurred. Police suspected that the attacker might have committed other crimes. This potentially means that there are a lot more cases that could be tied to Bowman. For those wondering, the Racine County Jane Doe was later identified as Peggy Johnson. Peggy was never reported missing. She was last seen at a homecoming dance in Harvard, Illinois in 1994. Most people who knew her assumed that she had just run away. An aunt worried enough to take out a classified ad in the paper. But nobody seemed to suspect that something terrible might have happened to the auburn-haired girl. Peggy disappeared shortly after her mother passed away, the sole parent in her low-income household. The 19-year-old found herself orphaned and homeless with a developmental disability that made it difficult for her to get a job. By chance, she met a nurse named Linda LaRoche who offered her work as a live-in housekeeper and nanny to her children. The teenager jumped at the opportunity. But over the next 5 years, LaRoche abused Peggy Johnson, beating her, starving her, and forcing her to live in a crawlspace. The violence culminated in 1999 when LaRoche allegedly ended 23-year-old Peggy's life and dumped her body in Raymond, Washington. No one could identify her, so she became known by the place where she was found, the Racine County Jane Doe. 20 years after Peggy's life was taken, Wisconsin police received a tip from a concerned citizen about a nurse who confessed to taking someone's life who worked for her in the late 1990s. In early November of 2019, Racine County authorities announced both Peggy's identity and LaRoche's arrest. In May of 2022, a judge in Racine County sentenced Linda LaRoche to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was also given an additional 5-year sentence for hiding Peggy's body. Peggy's step-aunt, Jenny Schroeder, had this to say to LaRoche: "I hope you have a slow, miserable time in your cage." In 1974, Carla Walker was a 17-year-old junior at Western Hills High School in Fort Worth, Texas. Just 4 feet 11 inches, Carla had honey blonde hair that fell below her shoulders. She was dating Rodney McCoy. He was described as a wiry, good-natured kid who was the quarterback of the football team. Rodney and Carla talked about enrolling together at Texas Tech University. She told her closest friends that she had no doubt that she and Rodney would someday marry and start a family. The evening of February 16th of 1974, Rodney arrived at the Walkers' home in Benbrook in far west Fort Worth to take Carla to the school's Valentine Day dance. When the event ended around 11:30, Rodney invited another couple to cruise Camp Bowie Boulevard and the Benbrook traffic circle with him and Carla. They stopped at a couple of teen hangouts, Mr. Quick Hamburgers and Taco Bell. After dropping off the others, Rodney and Carla drove to a nearby bowling alley, Brunswick Ridgely Bowl, where Carla used the restroom. Not long after Carla climbed in the car, the passenger door flew open. Rodney caught a glimpse of a tall man with short brown hair. He began bludgeoning Rodney over the head with the butt of a pistol. At some point, the gun's magazine clip dislodged and fell into the parking lot. The man grabbed Carla. Rodney, barely conscious, heard him say, "You're coming with me, aren't you, sweetie?" "Rodney, go get my dad," Carla said. "Go get my dad." Rodney came to the driver's seat sometime around 1 a.m. He sped to the Walkers' home, which was less than a mile away. He drove up over the curb onto the front lawn and slammed on the brakes. Carla's parents, Leighton and Doris, were still awake playing dominoes in the dining room with relatives. Carla's little brother Jim, who was 12 years old, and her elder sister Cindy, who was 18, were in the living room watching television. They heard someone banging at the front door and were stunned to see Rodney, blood dripping down his face. He was frantic. "Mr. Walker, they've got her," he shouted. "They're gonna hurt her bad." Leighton, a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel, grabbed his pistol and raced to the bowling alley. Doris dialed the operator on the family's rotary phone and asked to be connected to the police. Searching the parking lot, they found Carla's purse along with the magazine clip that had been ejected from the assailant's weapon. Other cops drove the surrounding streets in squad cars, scanning for any sign of Carla. After the sun rose, more joined the hunt. Peering through binoculars, a few circled the city in helicopters. When classes resumed on Monday morning, detectives visited Western Hills High. They studied contact sheets of photos taken at the dance looking for anyone who seemed out of place. They stopped kids in the hallways asking if they knew anyone who would want to hurt Carla. On February 20th of 1974, 4 days after Carla's disappearance, Two of the officers assigned to look for her were driving along a remote two-lane road near Benbrook Lake about 5 miles southwest of the bowling alley. They spotted a culvert and a concrete tunnel built to let water flow beneath the road and pulled over to peer inside. They saw a young woman lying on her back. Her face and neck were covered with scratches and deep bruises. It was Carla. It appeared that she had been strangled because there were no ligature marks around her neck. Investigators believed that the culprit had choked her using his hands. News of what happened to Carla covered almost the entire front page of the Star-Telegram. Her funeral, which was held at the Western Hills Church of Christ, was attended by more than 1,250 mourners, far more than the small sanctuary could hold. Fort Worth officials formed a task force of detectives from the area's police departments. The group didn't have much to investigate. No fingerprints had been identified on Carla's body or clothing. The blood on her dress had come from Rodney's head wounds. Traces of bodily fluid had been found, but the technology did not yet exist to identify a person from their DNA. And in that era, there were no surveillance cameras in parking lots and no license plate readers on the sides of the highways. The group did set up a 24-hour telephone tip line. At the downtown police headquarters, officers sat behind metal desks, sipping lukewarm coffee and listening to citizens pass on the names of men they believed were responsible. The detectives were told by various callers that Carla's life was taken by a pair of marijuana dealers, by a carnival worker at the Fort Worth Stock Show and Rodeo, and by a quiet young man who often bowled alone at the alley where Carla had been kidnapped. They heard stories about a boy who had supposedly gotten into an argument with Rodney at Mr. Quick Hamburger's the night before the dance. The detectives also hired a hypnotist to try to draw more details out of Rodney, who suffered a head injury during the incident. But the most significant memory he managed to recall was that Carla's kidnapper had been wearing a brown or tan cowboy hat. When the hypnotist snapped his fingers and Rodney awoke, he burst into tears. He was all torn up inside, tormented that he couldn't save his girlfriend. During one meeting, the task force detectives discussed another unsolved case that had taken place on February 7th of 1973, almost exactly a year before Carla's. That night, a young woman named Becky Martin did not return home after attending a night class at Tarrant County Junior College's South Campus. Her body was found almost 7 weeks later. It was so decomposed that there was no way to determine the cause. The medical examiner said Becky could have been stabbed or strangled or even shot through the stomach. What most intrigued the detectives about Becky's case was where her body had been found, in a culvert just outside the city limits. The two girls in two culverts, a year apart. It just seemed too coincidental for investigators. Although they said nothing publicly, the investigators began looking for a serial offender. By March, a month after Carla's life was taken, all the task force had to go on was one small lead. The detectives learned that the magazine clip found in the bowling alley parking lot belonged to a newer Model 22 Ruger handgun. They asked the federal government's Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms to provide them with the names of anyone living in Fort Worth who had purchased that model. The ATF came up with a list of a couple dozen people, and the task force set out to interview each one of them. One man on the list was 31-year-old truck driver named Glenn McCurley. McCurley was raised in West Texas, the eldest of 3 boys. When he was a teenager, his parents sent him to the Westview's boys' home in southwestern Oklahoma. Westview, which is sponsored by the Churches of Christ, promotes itself as a place for those who are deprived due to sickness in their family, boys experiencing significant problems in living with their family, boys needing supervision, and delinquent boys, those who have violated the law but who are not in need of treatment or detention, and abandoned, abused, or neglected boys. It's not clear why McCurley was sent to the home, or precisely how long he was there, but his stay clearly wasn't transformative. By February of 1961, he had left Westview and was in Abilene, Texas, where he stole a car. Then he abandoned that car and stole another one. The State Highway Patrol began to pursue him and shot out one of his tires. He drove the vehicle onto a vacant lot and attempted to escape on foot, but was quickly captured. In court, McCurley pleaded guilty and received a 2-year sentence. He was released early in the spring of 1962 when he was 19. He eventually moved to Midland, where he met a blonde high school student named Judy Watson. On February 16th of 1963, McCurley married Judy in a Baptist church. The young couple moved into a small rental home. McCurley eventually got a job as a truck driver for the U.S. Postal Service with a route to Dallas, Fort Worth area. Judy gave birth to 2 sons, Craig and Roddy. Then, in 1972, McCurley moved his young family to a neighborhood in West Fort Worth. McCurley and Judy enrolled their boys in the public elementary school, and they joined Ridgely West Baptist Church. McCurley got another truck driving job, hauling prefabricated slabs of concrete to construction sites. Judy worked at the church's daycare center. One man who knew McCurley did note a distasteful habit. He'd see a pretty girl and say something like, "Take a look at that." In early March of 1974, 2 detectives arrived at McCurley's home to interview him about his Ruger .22 pistol. When the officers asked about the gun, McCurley said that it had been stolen 6 weeks earlier from his pickup truck while he was fishing. He then agreed to come to downtown and take a polygraph test, which he passed. The task force promptly eliminated him as a potential suspect. By late spring of 1974, investigators still had little to show for their work. The task force didn't officially disband, but many of the detectives were ordered by their supervisors to return to their other cases. Strangers would occasionally call the Walkers' house, many of them anonymously, claiming they had information about who ended Carla's life. Layton talked to all of them. He took notes and kept them in a metal box the size of a cigar box. He wrote down names and addresses of potential suspects, and he drew circles on maps where he had been told the culprit lived. He was not going to rest until he knew the man responsible was behind bars. When Carla's younger brother Jim turned 16 and got his driver's license, he began spending his free time helping his dad hunt for the perpetrator. Sometimes on the anniversary, he would prowl the parking lot of the Brunswick Ridgely Bowl, looking for anyone suspicious. Jim took boxing lessons at the Panther Boys Club, joined the high school's wrestling and football teams, and went on long runs through his neighborhood. "I wanted to be ready in case I ever came across the culprit," Jim said. "My plan was to overpower him and take him someplace far away, maybe somewhere out in West Texas where no one can hear him scream." On February 19th of 1977, almost precisely 3 years after Carla's body was found, someone came across the body of 25-year-old June Ward, a vocational nurse lying next to a curb in South Fort Worth. June was naked except for a bra strap wrapped around her neck. She'd been strangled and beaten over the head with what the one reporter described as a sharp, heavy object. Detectives who had worked on the Carla Walker task force couldn't help but notice the similarities between the 2 crimes. Then, on July 9th of 1980, the body of a 19-year-old woman named Denise Hogue, described in the newspaper as an unemployed drifter, was found a few feet from a creek bridge in South Fort Worth. She too had been strangled. 2.5 years later, in February of 1983, the body of Christy Tower, a waitress at the Family Billy Bob's Texas nightclub in the Stockyards, was discovered in a field north of the city. Her hands were bound with electrical wire, and another wire was twisted around her neck. Like the other crimes, Christy's case remained a mystery. Though a few days after her body was found, detectives received a curious bit of news. They learned that Christy's purse had been found in a dumpster behind Cheers, a bar on Champ Bowie Boulevard. Cheers was only a half a mile from the Brunswick Ridgely bowling parking lot, the place where Carla had been kidnapped in February of 1974. Residents were getting more worried about the prospect of a serial offender. Such concerns grew when Catherine Davis, a 23-year-old aspiring model, went missing on September 9th of 1984. Her body was found in a field in far South Fort Worth. About a month later, on October 19th, Marilyn Hartman, a 25-year-old middle school teacher, was found gagged and strangled in her Fort Worth bedroom. Just 3 days after that, Cindy Heller, a 23-year-old Texas Christian University graduate and former beauty contestant, disappeared after last being seen near Hewlin Mall. She was later found strangled in a creek bed on the Texas Christian University campus. The tragedies kept piling up. On November 26th of 1984, Catherine Jackson, another local middle school teacher, was found naked in her bathtub with the water still running. She had been strangled with a cord. 2 weeks after that, Angela Ewer, a 21-year-old part-time model and programmer for an FM rock station, left her fiancé's house in southwest Fort Worth. The following day, her car was found abandoned by a highway in a southern part of the city, and her decomposed remains were eventually discovered in a field north of Fort Worth. On the evening of December 22nd, just days before Christmas, 21-year-old Regina Grover was seen with her boyfriend walking out of the Keg, a restaurant on Camp Bowie. She was found the next day, strangled and drowned in a creek under a bridge in North Fort Worth. Her boyfriend, who was found in his bed at his apartment, had been fatally bludgeoned. Fort Worth women, especially those living in the southwestern part of the city, were panicking. Local media reported on skyrocketing gun and mace sales. When the police department offered a free seminar on self-defense, more than 3,000 attended, most of them women. The police department formed another task force. "We're going to break this thing," Police Chief H.F. Hopkins promised. Detectives questioned every suspect, from ex-cons with long rap sheets to a freelance photographer. The investigation, though, was fruitless. The only welcome news was a lull in crimes. The culprit, if it was one culprit, seemed to have retreated. That was until February 24th of 1986. A passerby came across a woman's unclothed body, partially wrapped in a blanket lying on a hillside near a park in central Fort Worth. She had been strangled, but the police could not identify her through the usual means, fingerprints or dental records, nor did they receive any reports about a missing woman that might have provided a clue. Another year passed, and then another, and this time it really did appear as if the unknown man committing all these crimes had retreated for good. Carla Walker's little brother Jim had not given up. After graduating from Western Hills High, Jim had attended Sam Houston State University, where he read books on serial offenders and took courses in abnormal psychology so that he could better understand what he described as the criminal mind. After he graduated from college, he moved back to Fort Worth and applied to become an officer with the city's police department. His plan was to get promoted to detective and get his hands on Carla's files and find the man responsible. During a training session at the academy's firing range, however, Jim noticed something was wrong with his eyesight. A doctor later diagnosed him with a congenital eye condition. Forced to drop out of the academy, he went to work in security at a local office of defense contractor General Dynamics. But he continued hunting for the man responsible. After his father passed away in 1987 of a heart attack, Jim dug through the notes in Layton's metal box looking for new leads to pursue. After his mother passed away in 2015, Jim purchased his parents' home and moved into it with his wife. "I wanted to be there in case somebody ever got a conscience at 3 in the morning and showed up to confess," he said. In January of 2019, Detectives Leah Wagner and Officer Jeff Bennett decided to take another look at Carla's case after Jim made a request. Among those they re-interviewed was Carla's then-boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, who had moved to Alaska as soon as he graduated from high school to work on an oil rig, telling his family that he needed to get as far away from Fort Worth as possible. He eventually returned to Texas and was living near Austin when Wagner and Bennett reached him. To try to locate new witnesses, investigators posted a message on the police department's Facebook page. They got a couple dozen responses, including one from a woman who claimed that her ex-husband had grown up in the same neighborhood as Carla and had kept a stash of newspaper articles about her case, which he occasionally reread. A likely sign said the ex-wife that he was responsible. No doubt to the ex-wife's disappointment, the ex-husband was able to prove he'd been out of town the weekend Carla's life was taken. What the detectives needed was physical evidence. And the best physical evidence they could hope to find, of course, was the culprit's DNA. Since Carla lost her life, the technology of DNA identification had not only been developed, but had progressed beyond anyone's expectations. There were now even laboratories that specialized in genealogical mapping, in which technicians use freely accessible databases to link DNA from an unknown person to the DNA of that person's relatives. Fortunately for Wagner, and Carla's dress and other clothing she'd worn the night her life was ended had been carefully packed away in paper bags in the police department's evidence lab, which meant there was a chance that technicians still could turn up a usable sample of DNA. After all these years, however, there was no way of knowing whether the DNA had degraded, which would prevent the technicians from compiling a full genetic profile of the man responsible. Once more, Conducting DNA tests on Carlos Claus could cost the Fort Worth Police Department as much as $20,000. Money that was more likely to go towards active cases. Wagner and Bennett were determined to find at least one good lead, but they knew the odds were against them. Then, their investigation took an unpredictable turn. Vincent Strange was a 40-year-old Fort Worth aerospace technician and true crime buff. In 2017, he created a podcast about unsolved cases in Texas. His first story was going to be about Carla Walker, whose case he had read about while poking around the internet. He interviewed Carla's siblings, Jim and Cindy, as well as a few of her friends. One person who did listen to it was Diane Kuykendall. Diane had gone to school with Carla. Carla always smiled at her in the hallway, even though they didn't really know each other. Diane said it made her feel good and that she wishes that there was some way that she could pay Carla back. Diane decided to fly to Nashville to attend CrimeCon, an annual 3-day true crime convention that most recently attracted some 5,000 people. She brought along 80 copies of a pamphlet she had written about Carla's case. She handed out the pamphlets to the likes of Dateline's Keith Morrison, Fox News' Nancy Grace, and Paul Holes, a retired investigator who works for the Oxygen Network. Paul Holes was intrigued and convinced Oxygen to pay $18,000 to cover the cost of DNA testing on Carla's clothes. At a lab in California, technicians found some intact, untainted bodily fluid were found. From that fluid, they were able to develop a full DNA profile, which they uploaded to CODIS, a nationwide law enforcement database that contains the DNA of millions of criminal offenders. CODIS, however, couldn't find a match. Paul Holes and his producers contacted a Texas lab that also does genealogical mapping, but technicians there had no luck either. David Middleman, CEO of Oathrum, then got into contact with Paul Holes. He said he was optimistic that his particular DNA identification method, a sophisticated technology that used genome sequencing, could find a match. The morning of July 4th of 2020, David Middleman called Officer Bennett. "We've connected the DNA to a particular family tree," he said. "The last name is McCurley." After some further testing and police work, Middleman and Bennett landed on Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr., who had been living in Fort Worth at the time of Carla's demise. Bennett saw Glenn McCurley Jr. was the truck driver who had told the police back in 1974 that his Ruger 22 had been stolen. Wagner and Bennett did a background check on McCurley, but there was little to learn. As far as they could tell, other than his 1961 criminal conviction for stealing a car when he was 18, he had no encounters with the police. McCurley was no longer driving trucks full-time by then. He took on handyman jobs and did part-time maintenance work at a fitness club. Wagner and Bennett decided to pay him a visit. They arrived unannounced at the McCurley's home. McCurley and his wife Judy politely invited the detectives into the living room and chatted amiably. McCurley talked about his old truck driving gigs. Judy said she had spent 32 years at Ridgely West Baptist Daycare Program, finally retiring in 2004 because of health issues. She also mentioned that her husband suffered from diabetes and that he'd recently had surgery to remove a tumor the size of a quarter on his liver. "We're not ready for this," Judy said, "especially with his cancer." Finally, McCurley asked the detectives, his voice raspy, "What do y'all want to talk about?" "We're going to take you way back," Wagner said. "Back in 1974, y'all were living here at the time, so you may have heard about it. There was a young lady kidnapped from a bowling alley." "I know exactly which one you're talking about," Judy immediately said. Carla Walker. Judy later told detectives she could remember where the Walker family lived on Williams Road. "Kept her room the same way it was," she said. "They kept her car still parked in the driveway for years and years. You'd drive by and see that car parked in the driveway, and it was just absolutely heartbreaking." Detective Wagner said that she and Bennett had reopened the investigation and were contacting those who had been interviewed by police in 1974. "It's a huge case," she said, "and we saw at one point they had talked to you, Mr. McCurley." Wagner asked McCurley if she could take a DNA sample. "It would be the easiest way to eliminate him as a suspect," she explained. McCurley hesitated. Then he took a pen, signed a consent form, and opened his mouth so Wagner could dab the inside of his cheek with a Q-tip. Looking on, Judy told the detectives, "I hope you find out who was responsible." That girl needs to be remembered as someone who mattered. 11 days later, after lab techs verified that the DNA from McCurley's cheek perfectly matched the DNA found on Carla's bra strap, the members of the U.S. Marshals North Texas Fugitive Task Force arrived at his house to arrest him. He was driven downtown to the police department, where he waived his right to have a lawyer present during his interrogation. For several minutes, he sat alone in an interview room. At first, he denied any involvement. He claimed he had never seen Carla Walker before. Finally, he said with tears swelling in his eyes, "Okay, I did do it, I guess." He told the detectives that on the afternoon of February 16th of 1974, he had drunk whiskey and beer for several hours. He said he began driving around and parked in some parking lots. At one point, he drove to the bowling ball place. It seemed as if McCurley was about to confess. Instead, he told the detectives he'd heard a girl screaming in a nearby car. "I went over there to see if I could help. This big guy had her up against the door, jerking her around." McCurley said he opened the front passenger door and gotten into a tussle with the boy. He pushed him off Carla, led her back to his car, and then drove her to another parking lot. She started hugging me, thanking me, and one thing led to another. He claimed that everything that happened between him and Carla was consensual, and he did not know what had happened to her after that. After speaking to his court-appointed attorneys, McCurley pleaded not guilty. His attorneys argued in their court filings that Othram Labs' DNA test was flawed, and that Wagner and Bennett had coerced McCurley into a false confession. The attorneys also portrayed McCurley as feeble. "This man poses no threat to anyone. As far as I can tell, he has led an utterly uneventful life." 9 months later, on June 16th of 2021, the first pretrial hearing open to the public took place. Wearing a green jail-issued jumpsuit, McCurley was pushed into the courtroom in a wheelchair. When the actual trial got underway, a few months later, Carla's boyfriend Rodney testified about the night she vanished. Retired Detective Jim Minter took the stand to talk about the original investigation into Carla's case, and Wagner and Bennett testified about their own police work. Prosecutors D. Avignon and Emily Dixon unfolded the powder blue dress Carla had been wearing the night she was abducted and presented it to the jury. They also played 3 hours of the videotaped interview that Wagner and Bennett had conducted with McCurley after his arrest. And then, the prosecutors revealed a surprise piece of evidence, McCurley's .22 Ruger, which he claimed had been stolen. Police had discovered it during a search of his home, hidden away in a compartment above a door. The case, of course, was open and shut. On the third day of the trial, McCurley changed his plea to guilty, and the judge quickly sentenced him to life in prison. In the aftermath of the trial, there were still a lot of questions. Why would Glenn McCurley, a man with no violent criminal record, have committed such a sadistic crime? Was it an impulsive drunken act? Or was McCurley a depraved serial offender who was also responsible for taking the lives of other young Fort Worth women? And if he was a serial offender, why did he suddenly stop in the mid-80s? Did he have a genuine change of heart? Was that even possible? Investigators believe McCurley is responsible for many other crimes, and the investigations are currently ongoing. 21-year-old Jewel Jean Buskin, or Julie, as she will be referred to, lived in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma in 1996. Julie was born and raised in Benton, Arkansas, and moved to Oklahoma to study at Oklahoma University. She worked at the university's golf course. Julie was on her way to earning her bachelor's degree in dance. She was an aspiring ballerina and, after college, wanted to open up a studio and teach children to dance. Julie was described as popular and had many friends at school. She was also very talented. Julie spent the evening of December 19th of 1996 with her friend Ryan James at his grandparents' house. Ryan worked with Julie at the golf course. After dinner, they watched a movie. In addition, the two made plans to have lunch the next day. Julie stayed at his grandparents' house until 10 p.m., then left to hang out with some of her other friends. Julie and her friends played Monopoly and exchanged Christmas gifts. At one of the friends, Julie said her goodbyes since she was scheduled to move back home the next day. Her semester at college had just ended. Her roommate Megan was also there. Julie promised Megan she would give her a ride to Will Rogers Airport the next morning at 5 a.m. Julie and Megan decided to pull an all-nighter. They left the friend's house and drove to a restaurant called The Kettle around 2 a.m. When they were done, Julie and Megan drove to the gas station, got some gas and a cappuccino. They returned to their apartment a little after 3 a.m. to pick up Megan's belongings. A while later, the two left the apartment again and headed towards the airport around 4:30 a.m. Took them 30 minutes to get there. Julie dropped Megan off, and Megan watched Julie drive away from the airport in her Red Eagle Summit. Around 5:30 a.m., at the Dublin West apartments where Julie lived, many of the residents heard a woman scream in terror. One of the residents made a 911 call to report what they had heard. "Do you see anything outside?" "No, I'm kind of afraid to outside actually." A few hours later, Ryan James turned up at Julie's apartment for their scheduled lunch date. Julie was nowhere to be found, however. Her car was also missing. Ryan then reported her missing. Not long after that, Julie's parents arrived at her apartment. They drove from Arkansas to help Julie with her move back home. Instead of their daughter, they found policemen who informed them that Julie was missing. 12 hours after she disappeared, Julie Buskin's body was found on the bank of a lake about 15 miles from her apartment. Her hands were tied behind her back with a pair of shoelaces, and from the waist up, she was in the water. Julie had been shot once, execution style. The gunshot wound to the back of her head was a contact wound. There was also some evidence that she had been assaulted. At the lake, investigators found possible evidence in the sand near Julie's body. There were 2 sets of footprints that went down to the lake, and only one that returned. One set belonged to Julie and the other police believed belonged to the person who shot her. After examining the footprint and consulting Nike, it was determined that the footprint was consistent with a size 9 men's Nike running shoe. Specifically, a Nike Air 2 running shoe. About 20 feet from Julie's body, investigators found a crumpled pink leotard with the initials JB on the label. It was Julie's. The leotard had male DNA on it and was subsequently stored to be used later when DNA technology was more advanced. An autopsy confirmed Julie was shot with a single .22 caliber bullet. The specific gun used was quite distinctive, but more on that later. Julie Buskin had quite a lot of friends at the university, and investigators set out to interview as many of them as possible. They hoped someone could provide useful information, but that was not the case. There was no one that openly disliked Julie, and she didn't have any bad breakups or anything of the sort. Police found Julie's apartment in perfect order. There were no signs of any struggle taking place. They found Julie's car in an apartment complex just 1 block away from where she lived. Red sand on the floor of the car looked similar to the red sand at the banks of the lake where Julie's body was found. This was seen as rather bizarre by investigators. Why would someone abduct Julie, take her life at the lake, and then drive her car back to almost the exact location where the abduction took place? Frustratingly, there were no foreign hairs, fibers, or prints in the car. Also, no evidence of a struggle taking place. Julie's phone was missing. Investigators obtained her cell phone records to see if it could be useful. The cell phone records indicated that someone made 2 phone calls after she was not alive anymore. One of the calls was for the weather forecast and the other to a number not in service at the time. Despite the leads and a $70,000 reward, there were no significant breaks and the case went cold for a short while. Then a month after Julie's life was ended, a man called the police. He said that on the night Julie was abducted, he saw a car like hers pull out in front of him and they almost collided. This was near the lake. The witness followed Julie's car for about 5 miles because he wanted to confront the driver. The driver kept looking at the witness constantly through the rearview mirror and sped off. The witness saw a glimpse of the driver's face and was then tasked with describing him to the investigators. This is the sketch they came up with of the young man that was driving Julie's car away from the lake. He was possibly a college student, possibly Hispanic with long black hair and a muscular build. The composite sketch was broadcast repeatedly by the local media in Oklahoma. No one recognized him. The case went cold for 4.5 years. Police received a letter from a female inmate at the Oklahoma County Jail. She said an old acquaintance of hers might have taken Julie's life. He was 23-year-old Dennis Sturmer. Sturmer was a construction worker and had no criminal record. But at the time of the crime, he lived just 4 blocks away from Julie's apartment, and he bore a resemblance to the composite sketch. Sturmer refused to answer any questions and would not provide his DNA sample. Police had to get a court order to collect his DNA. His DNA profile was very, very close to the sample that was taken off the leotard at the crime scene. Very, very close is not a match, and he was not considered a suspect anymore. Sturmer's only immediate living male relative was his brother. This had to be him, right? It seemed like the 5-year-old cold case was finally going to be solved. But in a twist, his brother's DNA didn't match. Again, the case went cold. Sadly, Julie's parents had to accept the possibility that they might not live long enough to see justice take place. Investigators were determined for that not to happen, and they essentially attempted to collect DNA from every male Julie ever came into contact with. Over 200 men were tested, but no one matched. It seemed like the case might never get solved. 6 years after Julie's life was taken, a man by the name of Anthony Castillo Sanchez was arrested for assaulting his girlfriend. After the arrest, Sanchez had to give a DNA sample to law enforcement for testing. Investigators noticed some interesting facts about Sanchez's background. He lived just 1 mile away from Julie's apartment. One of Sanchez's girlfriends showed investigators her diary for the month in which Julie's life was ended. There was an entry where she stated that Anthony bought her a pair of Nike running shoes and got himself one as well. Sanchez wore a size 9 shoe. If nothing else, it proved Sanchez owned a pair of sneakers the same brand and size as the perpetrator. Interestingly, one of Anthony's exes had a cell phone number that was just 1 digit off of the number that was dialed on Julie's phone after she was not alive anymore. It was possible that Sanchez tried to call the ex's number from memory but got 1 digit wrong. Sanchez and his father had an unusual habit of firing .22 caliber guns at the wall inside the house they rented. Investigators collected a bullet from the house. It was determined that the bullet came from the same gun as the one used to shoot Julie. Only 6 companies made .22 caliber guns with the specific grooves found on the bullets. Finally, in 2004, Anthony Sanchez's DNA was compared to the male DNA found on Julie's leotard. It was, of course, a match. Sanchez was only 18 years old at the time of the crime. It is interesting to think about the fact that if he dialed the correct number on Julie's phone, he would have been caught instantly. Anthony Castillo Sanchez was convicted in 2006. It was decided that he was going to pay for the crime with his life. As recent as March of 2023, Sanchez was still challenging his conviction. He claimed it was his father who committed the crime and not him. His father, Glenn Sanchez, took his own life in April of 2022 and apparently told his girlfriend that it was him all along. Investigators already looked at the possibility that the DNA could actually belong to Glenn Sanchez, and it was not the case. Probability of the match being a mistake is 1 in 200 quadrillion for Caucasians, 1 in 20 quintillion for African Americans, and 1 in 94 quadrillion for Southwest Hispanics, according to the court documents. Anthony Sanchez is expected to be executed on September 21st of 2023. Murfreesboro, Tennessee is a place in the United States that saw a very famous battle take place during the Civil War, the Battle of Stones River. In recent years, Murfreesboro has enjoyed substantial growth, with many people flocking their thanks to the university. In 1984, a crime took place involving a university student that's still talked about today in Murfreesboro. On May 31st of 1984, a farmer in Murfreesboro, Tennessee made a startling discovery on his way home. The farmer saw some clothing lying in the field and decided to approach. When he did, he noticed the body of a girl was under the clothing. She was only wearing a bra and was covered with 2 pairs of jeans and a dark jacket. The sleeve of the jacket was wrapped around her neck. Investigators determined the first pair of jeans were hers and the second pair were men's jeans. There were also a pair of underwear found clutched in one of her hands. She was identified as 18-year-old Laura Salmon. Laura was born on October 6, 1965 in Tennessee. At the time, Laura was a local college student. She attended Middle Tennessee State University in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and furthermore, she also worked as a cashier at Kroger grocery store. The autopsy concluded that Laura lost her life due to blunt force trauma to the head. The weapon appeared to be the rocks found near her body. The blood on those rocks and other material were consistent with her being struck up to 10 times in the head. Also, during the autopsy, the medical examiner found that Laura had been intimate with someone within the last 24 hours or 48 hours prior to her life being taken. There were no injuries or any evidence found that showed it was not consensual. Naturally, one of the biggest leads for investigators was the pair of men's jeans found on top of Laura's body. Investigators found male DNA on the jeans from a different individual than the male that was intimate with Laura. This DNA likely belonged to the perpetrator. Unfortunately, DNA testing was still in its infancy, and there was not much else investigators could do with the DNA other than store it. Investigators then focused on creating a timeline of events, hoping that it would help them solve the case. Laura started her day by going to her job at the Kroger grocery store. The records showed that she left the store around 1 p.m. After that, she was supposed to go to an appointment at the Middle Tennessee State University to check her grades and meet with some of the office personnel. She also had plans to go swimming at her grandmother's house, but never made it there or the university. Investigators found Laura's car near the store, miles away from where her body was found. Investigators were unable to find any fingerprints in the car that did not belong to Laura. But, interestingly, they did find a foreign hair. It was stored alongside the DNA evidence they collected from the pair of jeans. Equally important, investigators found dirt in the wheel wells. The FBI lab determined that they were consistent and that there was a high probability that Laura's car had been on the road right next to the crime scene. This meant that someone took Laura's life and then drove her car back to her place of work. Other than making the investigators believe the perpetrator knew Laura, the lead was not fruitful. Witnesses came forward and placed Laura at a local nightclub on the night before her life was taken. The witnesses said Laura was dancing with an unidentified young man, but investigators could not locate him. Laura's body was found in an area that often served as a lover's lane for high school and college students. They went there to party, have bonfires, etc. The theory then became that Laura met a guy at the nightclub after she finished work and they went to Lover's Lane. There, Laura denied the unknown guy's advances and he took her life. Since investigators could not identify the young man, they talked to Laura's high school boyfriend, David Kyle Gilly. He was known to be the jealous type, but he had an alibi. His stepfather told the police that David was home all day when Laura's life was taken, so he could not be responsible. Thus, he was ruled out as a suspect. Just when investigators ran out of leads to follow, a woman in Nashville, Tennessee called the police with a possible lead. She claimed that she had been assaulted by a man named John Taylor. During the ordeal, Taylor apparently told her that he would do the same thing to her that he did to Laura. When questioned by the police, Taylor denied assaulting the woman and denied talking about Laura or having anything to do with her. A background check discovered that Taylor attended the same university as Laura. He was even a member of the same health club, Olympus Athletic Club and Spa. Taylor also attended the same fraternity, gatherings, and functions as Laura. Even more relevant, Taylor was near the university on the day that Laura's life was taken. Taylor had a history of being violent towards his girlfriends or his female companions. All this added to his possibility of being a suspect. Investigators then had FBI analysts compare Taylor's hair to the foreign hair they found inside of Laura's car. They received a report back from the FBI that the hair recovered from the vehicle was consistent with John Taylor's hair. Case closed, right? Another asshat caught. But not quite. At the time, mitochondrial DNA testing of human hair was still quite a few years away. The hair could have belonged to about 20% of the population. This was, of course, not concrete enough to arrest Taylor. Even though it seemed like a done deal, there would be a few more twists in this case. Investigators found nothing to link him to the crime scene or to confirm that he was with Laura on that day. The men's pair of jeans found at the crime scene had an inseam of 36 inches and the waist was 30 inches. Taylor was a small fellow and the jeans would not have fit him. Investigators had no choice but to move on to other suspects. Over the years, they looked into over 100 suspects, but nothing came of it. Laura's mother, Laureen Mackey, made a promise to Laura at her grave. She promised Laura that she would see that justice was done. Laureen didn't really know how she would fulfill that promise, but she decided it was the last thing she could do for Laura. Many long years would pass before help finally came. Dan Goodwin was one of Laura's friends at the university. He went out with her a few nights before her life was ended. Dan asked her if she wanted to go see a movie, and they wound up at the cinema on May 27, 1984, where they saw a matinee show of The Natural with Robert Redford. At Laura's funeral, Dan promised her mother that he would help find the perpetrator. After graduation, Dan became a newspaper reporter at the Daily News Journal in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. There, he became the police reporter. He wrote about a series of unsolved cases in 1987 which included Laura's case. Dan knew that he was more interested in the actual police work than simply just writing about it. Several years later, Dan left journalism and became a police officer. The very first cold case he was assigned was Laura Salmon's. One of the first things Dan did was send all of the evidence back to the forensic lab for testing. DNA technology had greatly advanced and completely new testing took place. While that was ongoing, Dan followed other leads, one of which came from a high school student. In 2000, a student at Oakland High School was talking about the Laura Salmon case. The student told everyone that his father took the life of a girl in 1984 and thrown her body away. The student's father was David Patterson. He had a police record for aggravated assault. Unfortunately, when Dan wanted to try to speak to Patterson, he learned that Patterson was not alive anymore. He had been fatally shot. Dan, of course, still decided to continue following the lead. They obtained DNA from Patterson's children. The DNA was compared to the male DNA found at the crime scene. It was not a match and he was ruled out as a suspect. Dan then went back to John Taylor, who was initially a suspect in the case. His DNA also did not match. In case you were wondering, Dan also provided a DNA sample. After it was tested, it confirmed that Dan was not responsible. Dan then turned his attention to one man who went under the radar in the initial investigation. The name that caught his eye was David Gilley. As earlier mentioned, David was Laura's high school boyfriend, a year younger than her. He was initially ruled out because of the alibi he was given by his stepfather. Dan, however, found that a witness came forward that directly contradicted that alibi. The witness saw David Gilley driving Laura's car on the day that her body was found. She spotted him not far from the road that led to the area where Laura was found. According to the witness, David had a blank expression on his face and was just staring straight ahead. She was able to identify him through a photo lineup as well as Laura's car. Dan also saw David's propensity of violence towards women in his life. This included Laura Salmon. Sometimes he would get mad at her, grab her by the head, banging her head into car school lockers or whatever was nearby. He even sometimes punched her on one occasion. He broke out 2 of her front teeth. Dan could not believe David Gilley was so quickly ruled out during the initial investigation. David was approximately 6 foot 2 inches tall, and the men's jeans that were found at the crime scene would have fit him perfectly. Dan then got Jerry Finley's help on the case. He is a crime scene reconstructionist. Jerry found tiny drops of blood in the jeans. It was medium-velocity impact spatter. This sort of spatter usually gets produced when someone is hit with a blunt object such as a rock. The majority of the bloodstains were just above the knee. This indicated that the perpetrator was kneeling on the ground as he was hitting Laura with the rocks. All of this evidence just confirmed to investigators that the men's pair of jeans belonged to the person who took Laura's life. It was already believed, but DNA testing confirmed that the blood on the jeans belonged to Laura. Dan then tracked David Gilley down in Florida. By then, Gilley was twice divorced and he was working for the Manatee County Public Works Department. Unsurprisingly, he had a police record. Gilley had arrests for battery, attempted burglary, and resisting arrest. When Dan questioned Gilley, he once again denied any involvement and said that he is not responsible for what happened to Laura. In a strange twist, Gilley did admit that the jeans were probably his. When investigators told him that they believed the owner of the jeans is the perpetrator, he quickly requested an attorney. Investigators then obtained a saliva sample from David Gilley. On May 31st of 2000, DNA testing proved that Gilley was the donor of the DNA found at the crime scene and thus responsible for taking Laura's life. On the 16th anniversary of the crime, David Gilley was finally arrested. Dan the man kept his promise to help Laura's mother in solving the case, and Laura's mother kept her promise to Laura that she would see justice take place. The motive was believed to be jealousy. If Gilly could not have Laura, he believed no one else could either. When she went off to college and he was still in high school, she made new friends and he didn't like that. He would often stalk her. Laura's mother tried to convince Laura to get a restraining order against Gilly, but she was too afraid. Investigators believe that Gilly somehow coaxed Laura out to the deserted lover's lane, where he struck her in the head repeatedly with rocks. After seeing that there was blood on his jeans, Gilly took them off and left them at the crime scene. He then drove Laura's car to her workplace, where it would later be found. In September of 2006, David Gilly went on trial. The defense claimed the presence of another man's DNA was proof that someone else was at the crime scene. The jury never believed any other DNA at the crime scene belonged to the real perpetrator. Gilly was found guilty of all the charges against him, and he was sentenced to life in prison. 31-year-old Linda Slayton lived in Lakeland, Florida. She had two sons, 12-year-old Tim and 15-year-old Jeff. On the morning of September 4th of 1981, Linda's sister Judy Butler had gone to their home so the two could have coffee, but when she arrived, Judy found her sister's body and quickly called 911. Linda was laying on the bed with a wire hanger wrapped around her neck. She had been assaulted and strangled. Investigators who arrived at the scene had to break the news to her two sons. They found Jeff sleeping in the living room and told him to put on some clothes and go outside. Once outside, Jeff saw what looked like every cop in the state of Florida, news crews, and his Aunt Judy was out there crying. Judy then told him what had happened to Linda. In the second bedroom, an officer woke up Linda's other son, Tim. Still in his pajamas, Tim walked past his mother's closed bedroom door. The door then swung open as an officer left the room. He then saw the whole crime scene. Investigators believed that the perpetrator entered Linda's bedroom window as the screen had been removed. They also found a palm print on the windowsill. Furthermore, they were able to collect DNA belonging to an unknown man from her body. Investigators then tried to learn more about Linda to try to find if the person responsible was someone close to her. They looked at Linda's ex-husband, Frank Slayton. She divorced him in 1974 when she was 24 years old. He was a violent alcoholic and would turn abusive and hit Linda. Even though he was an asshole, investigators could not link him to the crime. Another person investigators looked at was Jeff Slayton. They interviewed him a few times but could not prove that he was responsible either. Investigators also looked into Joe Mills. 20-year-old Mills was Tim's football coach at school. After getting divorced, Linda struggled for work, made her own clothes to save money, and could not afford a car. Mills then drove Tim to and from practice every day. Investigators could not link Mills to the crime scene either. Sergeant Edgar Pickett worked at the Lakeland Police Department as a fingerprint expert. He scoured the entire crime scene and was the one that found the palm print on the windowsill. The palm print and the DNA taken from Linda's body was stored, so it could be used at a later date. Jeff and Tim moved in with their grandparents, Clarence and Margaret Harris. They were terrified and almost never left the house. They all slept in the same room except Grandpa Harris. He would stand guard with a gun all night while they slept. The grandparents hoped a quick return to familiar routines would help their distraught grandsons. A few weeks after their mom's funeral, the boys were back in school. They decided to focus on football. This is a photo of Tim's football team taken a month after Linda's life was taken. Tim hung the photo in his bedroom. He said it reminded him of something his mom taught him, to keep moving forward and never giving up. In recent years, Jeff and Tim stated that there is still grief and guilt for not hearing anything that night, for not coming to their mom's rescue. In March of 1999, investigators had developed a full DNA profile of the person that took Linda's life. All they needed was a match. Detective Brad Grice took over the case in 2001. He took dozens of DNA samples from prior persons of interest, submitting them to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for comparison. Detective Grice then met with Jeff and Tim. He took DNA samples from the brothers to clear them again. He also promised them that he would not retire until he solved their mother's case. Frank Slayton, who had stopped drinking, also volunteered to sample, but none matched. Then, in September 2001, Detective Grice got a tip. Nearly a year after Linda's life was taken, a 24-year-old man named Jimmy Ulmer pulled a 10-year-old girl through her bedroom window and nearly took her life. Ulmer was convicted of that and sentenced to 80 years in prison. The savage assault seemed eerily similar to Linda's case. Furthermore, Detective Grice discovered that around the time Linda's life was ended, Jimmy Ulmer had been staying with a friend who happened to live in the very same apartment complex as Linda. Detective Grice, along with Jeff and Tim, felt confident that they had their man. Ulmer passed away in prison in 1996, but Grice got a DNA sample from his mother. When his DNA did not match the DNA from the crime scene, was massive disappointment. Felt like they were back to square one. By 2005, Detective Grice was headed up to a new cold case unit and got the FBI to run the DNA profile continuously through all federal databanks. But the years continued to pass without a match. In 2015, Detective Grice had medical problems which forced him to retire, meaning he unfortunately couldn't keep his promise. All hope was not lost, however, as in 2018, groundbreaking DNA technology began to electrify the law enforcement community. Genetic genealogist CC Moore decided to take on Linda's case. She is a renowned expert in the field of investigative genetic genealogy. CC has been responsible for solving so many cold cases, many of which have been covered on this channel. Moore uploaded the DNA profile to a public genealogy website called GeneMatch. She then meticulously constructed branch by branch the culprit's family tree. She made these connections by poring over birth certificates, marriage license, obituaries, and social media to fill in the family tree with names. Moore explained that she uncovered 3 branches of the perpetrator's family tree that ultimately narrowed to the one person most likely responsible. She said that the 3 genetic networks converged into one family tree that pointed at one immediate family. The man was the only son in that family, so it had to be him that was the DNA contributor. After hundreds of leads and dead ends, after dozens of suspects were investigated and cleared, CC Moore identified the man in one weekend. The man is Joseph Clinton Mills, Coach Joe, who drove Tim to and from practice. Authorities wanted to be certain before they notified the brothers. CC Moore's final 2019 report confirmed that Joseph Mills, then 58, was living in Kathleen, Florida, about a half an hour from the crime scene. Detectives Tammy Hathcock and Russell Hurley were the next generation of Lakeland investigators who worked on Linda's case. The detectives then combed over the original case files and learned that Mills was interviewed initially, but just briefly. Mills told them that he dropped him off at his house and that he did not know what happened to Linda. Detectives found that Mills was convicted in 1984 of grand theft for forging a will. He never went to jail, but he was fingerprinted and had a palm print taken as well. In August of 2019, investigators compared those prints to the palm print Sergeant Pickett lifted off Linda's windowsill nearly 38 years before. It was a match. High-tech genetic genealogy had identified Mills as the likely culprit, and an old-fashioned palm print helped confirm his identity. Detective Hathcock and Hurley still needed to compare a fresh DNA sample from Mills to the decades-old DNA recovered from the crime scene. They covertly took Mills' trash back to the police department. They discovered a piece of used medical adhesive tape and sent it off to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab for testing. 11 days later, the tests came back and it was confirmed that Joseph Mills took the life of Linda Slayton. Only then could her sons Jeff and Tim be informed that the monster had finally been caught. Tim said he had looked up to Coach Joe and was now sickened that he had this photo of him all these years. Even more sickening was that Mills continued driving Tim to and from practice after he took Linda's life. On December 12th of 2019, detectives arrested Joseph Mills. Here is a picture of Detective Tammy Hathcock reading him his rights. He showed no emotion and didn't ask why he was being arrested, almost as if he already knew. After the arrest, Tim and Jeff went to meet Sergeant Edgar Pickett, now 94 years old, to personally thank him for collecting the palm print all those years back. In 2022, pled guilty to all charges. At his sentencing, Linda's family wanted to know why. Jeff yelled at him in court, "Why? I just want to know why, Joe. Why'd you take my mama from me? I loved my mama. We was happy." Mills' response infuriated everyone. "I am a good person. I'm not that person that they're painting me out to be." Finally, in February of 2022, Mills was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. C.C. Moore said, "We owe a huge debt of gratitude to those original crime scene investigators, because at the time this crime was committed, they didn't even know DNA was going to be used in criminal investigations. And so the fact they collected that and then it was stored responsibly and carefully all these years by that department is so important. If that hadn't happened, we couldn't have done our work." Jeff and Tim say they're determined to move on the best they can, to live life well for their mom and for their families. The brothers also know they never would have survived their ordeal without each other. They remain extremely close, live just a few miles apart, and share passionate hobbies like restoring cars. Jeff and Tim visit their mom's grave together often and burn a candle next to a portrait of her every anniversary. 36-year-old Flora Stevens lived in Sullivan County, New York in 1975. She was an employee at the Concord Hotel and was married to Robert Stevens. On August 3, 1975, Robert dropped her off for a doctor's appointment at the Community General Hospital located in Monticello, New York. When Robert returned to pick her up, she had vanished. He reported her missing after he was unable to find her. Detectives periodically reviewed the case to find Flora, but were never able to develop leads. On September 15th of 2017, the Sullivan County Sheriff's Office was contacted by a New York State Police investigator who said a set of unidentified skeletal remains were found in southern Orange County. The woman whose body had been dumped roughly matched Flora's general characteristics, and the investigator was hoping that any living relatives could provide DNA for identification. Instead, investigators discovered someone was using Flora's social security number in Massachusetts. Detectives tracked down the social security number to an assisted living facility in Lowell, Massachusetts. Staff at the facility confirmed that the number belonged to Flora Harris, who had been at the facility since 2001. Investigators decided to go talk to 78-year-old Flora, but found she suffers from dementia and is unable to speak more than 1 or 2 words at a time. She did recognize her ID from the Concord Hotel as her own. Officials were able to trace Flora's medical records back about 30 years and learned she spent time in a nursing home in New Hampshire and at St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital in Manhattan. Unfortunately, because of her illness, it is still a mystery how and why she disappeared from Monticello in 1975 and where she went. Frustratingly, authorities have been unable to locate any living relatives. When showed a picture of her younger self, Flora said, "Me?" And when showed a picture of her husband, Robert, she said, "Robert." This confirmed to investigators that Flora Stevens and Flora Harris is the same person. Speaking of Robert, he unfortunately never found out what happened to his wife and he is not alive anymore. Gabriel Nagy lived in Sydney with his wife Pamela, his son Stephen, and his daughter Jennifer. Gabriel immigrated to Australia with his parents when he was a young boy and loved living there. He was a devoted father and had a family that respected him and could not imagine anything ever getting between them. But unfortunately, something did. Gabriel worked as a shop fitter. He helped companies build retail spaces around the city. He wanted to be an accountant, however, and was taking classes to achieve his dream. On January 21st of 1987, Gabriel went into the city to run some errands. He called his wife Pamela to tell her that he would be home for lunch. Pamela made food for him and waited for her husband, but he never came home. She waited until she received a call that changed her life forever. The police had found the burned-out shell of Gabriel's car on the side of the road. There was no sign of him to be found. Pamela and her 2 children started putting out missing persons flyers all over Sydney. Surely someone had to know what happened to Gabriel after the car accident. Unfortunately, no one knew. 2 weeks after Gabriel disappeared, the police determined that he withdrew money from a bank in the city of Newcastle. Newcastle is about 100 miles away from Sydney. His family was hopeful about the new lead and believed this would help them find Gabriel. The lead turned into a dead end, however, and the case went cold for 2 more decades. There was a senior constable by the name of Georgia Robinson. She promised herself that she would solve this case. In her last attempt at finding Gabriel, she did just that in 2012. She looked through some files when she came across something interesting. The Medicare system in Australia showed documents that a person named Gabriel Nagy recently underwent eye surgery. The records also showed that the man went by another name, Ron Saunders. Constable Robinson called this man. He told her that the last 2 decades of his life was fuzzy to say the least. He spent most of his time homeless, just wandering from city to city. That was until a pastor by the name of Barry Hale came across Gabriel. The pastor gave Gabriel a job at the church as a caretaker. Gabriel got the name Ron Saunders from a sign for the Queensland Saunders Beach while he was wandering around. His memory slowly came back, so when he got the eye surgery, he gave the name of Gabriel Nagy as well. Robinson flew to where Gabriel was currently living and showed him pictures of his family. More and more of his memories started to come back. The car accident Gabriel was in left him with a serious head injury. He then fell into a fugue state which led him to forget everything about his life. Gabriel described the situation as unreal. He still didn't fully remember his family. He vowed to keep in touch, but he couldn't bring himself to move back in with his family. This is a photograph of Pamela and their daughter Jennifer with the photo album they showed Gabriel. And here is a picture of Gabriel and Jennifer when they first saw each other again in 2012. Carlina Renee White was born on July 16 of 1987 in New York City to parents Joy White and Carl Tyson. On August 4, 1987, when Carlina was 19 days old, her parents took her to the hospital since she had a fever. A woman that was dressed as a nurse had comforted the parents at the hospital but was in fact not a hospital employee. Her name is Petway. Petway came up with the idea to pretend to be a nurse at the hospital so that she could abduct a baby. She had a series of miscarriages and came to the realization that she could not conceive. At 2:30 a.m. in the morning, after Carlina's parents brought her to the hospital, Petway removed Carlina's foreline and abducted her. The hospital had video surveillance, but at the time it was not working. Thus, the only description of the woman came from Joy White and Carl Tyson. A guard said that a woman matching the description left the hospital at 3:30 a.m. and that no infant was visible, but the baby could have been covered up. The abduction of Carlina White became known as the very first known infant abduction from a New York hospital. Carlina was raised as Nedra Nady Nance by Petway in Bridgeport, Connecticut. This was about 45 miles from where her parents lived. Carlina attended Thomas Hooker School and graduated from Warren Harding High School. Petway and Carlina later moved to Atlanta, Georgia. Carlina did grow suspicious in her teens that Petway was not her biological mother, because she was not able to provide a birth certificate. In 2005, Carlina was pregnant. She asked Petway to give her the birth certificate so that she could apply for health insurance. Petway then obtained a forged Connecticut birth certificate. When Carlina attempted to use it, the officials told her that it was a forged document. When confronted by Carlina, Petway finally confessed that she was not her biological mother. Petway did not tell the entire truth, however. She told Carlina that she had been abandoned by a drug addict. When Carlina was 23 years old, she used websites such as the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. There, she found images of the kidnapped Carlina White that resembled infant photos of herself as Nedra and those of her daughter, Simani. Carlina decided to call the center's hotline and was able to get into contact with her birth family. In January of 2011, DNA tests confirmed that she was the missing Carlina White. After the confirmation that Nedra Nance was really Carlina White, the Federal Bureau of Investigation began a search for Petway. Petway turned herself into the FBI office at Bridgeport on the morning of January 23 of 2011. Petway confessed and told federal investigators that she kidnapped Carlina after enduring several miscarriages because of the stress over whether she would ever be able to be a parent. On July 30th of 2012, 50-year-old Petway was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The judge said that she was selfish and inflicted a parent's worst nightmare on a couple. Petway served her sentence in the Federal Correctional Institution, Aliceville in Alabama, until she was released on April 14th of 2021. Carlina's reunion with her parents was not so smooth. There were conflicts about money, the fact that Carlina still wanted to be called Nettie, and her love for Petway. But with the last public updates, it does fortunately seem like Carlina made peace with her parents and they are all on good terms. Nguyen Taven was a 16-year-old student living in Hanoi, Vietnam in 1992. Nguyen was very beautiful and got the attention of a lot of boys. This led her to not focus on her studies at all, and she spent most of her time out with her friends. One such evening she arrived home after curfew and her mother refused to open the door for her. That night, Nguyen disappeared. Her mother, Vu Thi Ha, regretted what she did greatly. She was quoted as saying, after being refused into her home, Nguyen went to a karaoke bar with her friends where she met a woman called Tan. This woman led Nguyen and her friends to a bar near the Chinese-Vietnam border. They spent the night drinking and singing. The next morning, Nguyen woke up and was shocked to learn that she and her friends were held captive in a house in China. The woman forced Nguyen and her 3 friends to marry Chinese men of around 70 and 80 years old. When Nguyen refused, she was punished. Eventually, Nguyen was introduced to 5 men for her to marry. One of them was 40 years old. She married the man that was 40, as she was scared about what they were going to do to her if she refused them at all. A year later, she had a child with her husband and learned that the house they lived in was situated in the Guangdong province. Nguyen tried to run away twice and both times she failed. After the failure of her 3rd attempt, she was chained for 2 weeks. Nguyen met a Vietnamese driver who worked at a farm near her house. She begged him to help her after she told him the whole story. The driver came up with the idea of putting her in a cage with pigs in the back of his truck to make sure she was not seen. They drove for 70 miles before taking a cab. They kept moving to the Vietnam-China border for another 100 miles. After saying goodbye to the cab driver, the truck driver and Nguyen traveled for 3 more months on their way to the border. At the border, they met a taxi driver who took them over the border for free since they had no money. Once entering Vietnam, Nguyen was scared that her family had passed away. This was now 21 years after she disappeared. The truck driver told Nguyen, however, if your parents passed away and your family does not accept you, you can come back and live with me. With that reassurance, Nguyen went to look for her family. She asked many people for help, since Hanoi changed so much since she had left. In a surprise twist, the 6th person she asked was her very own uncle. They did not recognize each other until Nguyen told him she was Miss Ha's daughter. Her uncle dropped the bundle of vegetables he was carrying and ran to his sister's house. At first, she did not believe him until she saw her long-lost daughter with her own eyes. Data from Vietnam's Ministry of Public Security shows that since 2010, there have been over 3,000 cases of human trafficking involving almost 7,000 victims, mostly women and children, from poor and rural areas. A majority were sold to men seeking wives in China, Malaysia, and South Korea, or just to simply bear children. China rescued more than 1,100 women trafficked into the country, many of them sold as brides, in a joint operation with Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam between July and December of 2018. Petra Psika was a 24-year-old computer science student at the Braunschweig University in Germany. On July 26 of 1984, she visited her dentist and then went to a shop to buy a printer cartridge that she planned to give to her younger brother Karsten for his birthday. Petra also told her neighbor Misha to water her plants while she is away. She planned on visiting her parents in Wolfsburg for the holidays. Petra informed her parents how she is looking forward to be there for the holidays, finishing her schoolwork and looking after her younger brother. Her family was excited for Petra to come home, but unfortunately, she never did. At first, they thought that she stayed longer at the university, but there were no signs of her there. 2 days later, when she missed Karsten's birthday party, her parents reported her missing. A massive police search then ensued. Her disappearance was featured on TV as well, but no leads came in. There was not much to go on for the police, and the case went cold. In 1985, a 19-year-old carpenter's apprentice simply known as Gunter K. confessed to ending the lives of both Petra and a 14-year-old. The police did not believe his story, however, and found that he had nothing to do with Petra's disappearance. In September of 2015, 31 years after Petra disappeared, there was finally a breakthrough in the case. The police were called to an apartment in Dusseldorf belonging to a 55-year-old woman by the name of Petra Schneider. She wanted to report a burglary. The police wanted to see her ID, and only then did she tell them the truth. She then admitted that she is the girl that went missing 31 years ago. She said that she carefully planned her disappearance. Even after being found, she wants no contact with her family. Since her disappearance, she had been living in various places across Germany under the name Petra Schneider. She had no passport identity card, bank account, doctor, dentist, or insurance. Petra saved up 4,000 Deutschmarks, equivalent to $2,000, to fund her disappearance. She avoided everyone and kept to herself mostly. If it wasn't for the burglary at her apartment, the case may never have been solved. Her family is devastated. Her father passed away a few years ago, but her brother and mother were in shock and in tears when they heard the news. The police tried to arrange a reunion between Petra and her family, but she is adamant about never wanting to see them again. Let me know in the comments section if you think Petra should have told her family she was safe after leaving. Denise Balser was a 24-year-old woman living in Raymond, New Hampshire. She worked as a bookkeeper for a small company. On January 17th of 1985, she disappeared, and the only lead was a note that was left behind. When her husband came home, he found the note which read, "We've got your wife." A few days after her disappearance, police found her pickup truck at Logan Airport in Boston. Her social security card, birth certificate, and credit cards were neatly organized and still in the car. Authorities pursued the theory that she may have been kidnapped, but could find no real evidence aside from the anonymous note. They later came to believe that perhaps she had left on her own accord, but her family, with whom she was very close with, believed foul play was involved. A year after she disappeared, she was indicted in absentia for embezzling $12,000 from the company that she worked for. That was all the police had to go on, and the case went cold. That was until 17 years later in 2002. It was then that the FBI believed that they found her. She was now going by the name of Denise Jones. She was still a bookkeeper and had started a new family. 42-year-old Denise was elated to see her family when they knocked on the door. She explained that her boss wanted to end her life because of the embezzlement. Denise claimed that it was closer to $100,000 that she embezzled. The county prosecutors dropped the charges against her because her former boss was long deceased. Denise lived in South Carolina, the Bahamas, California, and Hawaii while she was missing, and lived in Florida since 1996. Her current husband was stunned, but said a lot of things that didn't make sense before did now. Denise would always be depressed on Mother's Day and out of sorts on holidays. She never talked about her family. 46-year-old Craig Williamson and 41-year-old Christine Reinhard married at Lake Tahoe, California on October 7th of 1990. It was a second marriage for both of them. Craig and Christine had known each other for only a month, but they knew from the start that they loved each other. Christine said being married to Craig is like a honeymoon. She said he is the most sincere, loving, and caring person. The two bought a farm in Clintonville, Wisconsin, Christine's home state, and undertook an immediate renovation. They added to the barn and installed large tanks and began to raise an exotic and tasty African fish called tilapia. Their plan was to get into the lucrative business of fish farming and selling the tilapia across the country. Craig specially rigged an old-school bus to transport the fish. On August 28th of 1993, Craig loaded up and set off for Colorado to sell the fish. Christine was worried about him driving because he had suffered a concussion 4 weeks earlier. He was still experiencing headaches and blurred vision. When Craig arrived in Colorado Springs, he rented a car for business appointments. At 9 p.m. on August 30th, the night before he was to return home, he and Christine spoke for the last time on the phone. Craig was 1,000 miles away from the farm in Clintonville, Wisconsin, when he disappeared in Colorado Springs. The next day, his credit cards were discovered at a market in El Paso, Texas, 675 miles south of Colorado Springs. 2 weeks later, in Juarez, Mexico, just across the border from El Paso, Craig's rental car was found abandoned. Nothing useful could be found around or inside the car. No signs pointing to where Craig was or what happened to him. There were no signs of foul play. Christine had two choices. She could either sit at home waiting for police in distant cities to call her back, or she could do something herself. Christine did something. On September 14th of 1993, Christine arrived in Colorado Springs. She put up missing persons flyers in the areas where Craig had been. Christine also visited the hotel that Craig had last been seen in. One of the employees showed her room 112 where Craig had stayed. He showed her the bathroom and said that all of Craig's stuff was there and he had a book on the sink. In the bedroom, he showed her that Craig's luggage was on the chair next to the bed. The luggage was unpacked and unopened. The bed was made and looked like it was not slept in. There was no evidence of any struggle taking place. Christine believed that Craig had been attacked the day he vanished. She believed that due to his prior injuries, he wandered off to an unknown location. Detective Robert Johnson headed the investigation in Colorado. He showed Christine the area where they found the school bus with the fish still parked.
The day he vanished.
Christine theorized that Craig checked on the school bus and then on his way to the rental car, someone came up behind him and hit him over the head. She was quoted as saying, "And he would wander toward the bright lights of the parking lot and the interchange, and he wandered off from there." The case went cold for a short while as investigators and Christine were unable to find useful leads. Then, television stations in Colorado and Wisconsin reported about Craig's disappearance and Christine's search. Within days, a retired nurse from Montana came forward to report what she had witnessed. The retired nurse is Judy Inman. She saw the coverage of Craig's disappearance on the television and recognized him. 2 weeks after Craig vanished, Judy was traveling from Montana to Washington on a train when she saw a disheveled-looking man on board. She recalled when the man first got on the train, 2 drunks were harassing him. She saw the man walking down the aisle, clearly looking for something. He then said he had to get back to the fish and kept saying it over and over again. The man talked about a big building with big tanks where they kept the fish, and that the fish were not from America. Being a retired nurse, Judy Inman knew that there was something wrong with the man. She knew that he was not drunk or mentally ill. Judy was able to determine that he definitely had some sort of head injury because she had taken care of patients like that in the past. After hearing what Judy had said, Christine was convinced that the man on the train was indeed Craig, especially because of his ramblings about the fish from out of state. She also believed he was headed to Washington because they had initially met there. Christine packed up everything she would need and traveled to Washington. She also packed a bag for Craig in the outside chance that she found him. Christine set off on a 6-week odyssey, paralleling Judy Inman's train route from Whitefish, Montana to Portland, Oregon. Christine photographed all the train stations along the way and went to various locations along the train route that Judy Inman and the man were on. On December 26th of 1993, Christine met Judy Inman in person for the first time and showed her the photographs of each train station along the route. Judy believed that the man resembling Craig had gotten off at Wishroom, Washington, near the Oregon border. She recognized the building because it was small and she remembered the color. Christine believed that Craig might have mistaken Wishroom for Washougal. Washougal is a town that Craig had lived in during the 1980s. Craig's son went to Wishroom and plastered the area with this poster, but no new clues surfaced. Unfortunately, no trace of Craig was found. Christine then talked about how difficult it was going back to the farm in Wisconsin empty-handed. "It was absolutely terrible to drive back here after looking for Craig for the 6 weeks that I did. This place was so cold and empty. Everywhere I looked, things reminded me of Craig all the time. I can't give up. I will never give up. I will just constantly look for him until I am no longer alive or he is found. Those are the only 2 options. Know he is alive, and I know someday I will find him. The trouble is, I do not know when, and I just have to keep hanging on. The hardest part is hanging on." Investigators suspected that Craig may have staged his disappearance based on how his credit cards were left in plain sight. They also noted that his rental car had beard clippings in it. Lab technicians determined that they had been cut with scissors, suggesting that he was changing his appearance. He had $2,500 cash with him when he vanished. He and Christine also had put all of their money into the farm and borrowed another $400,000. Finally, his bus seemed ill-equipped to bring fish back from Colorado. It had no tanks, fish food, or coolers. On May 25th of 1994, Craig's disappearance was covered on Unsolved Mysteries. They described him as a 49-year-old man, 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighing 190 pounds. He had gray hair and blue eyes. They also showed television footage of Craig. It was filmed in Wisconsin in February of 1993, 6 months before Craig disappeared. In a twist, Craig saw a re-airing of the broadcast and recognized himself in July of 1995. He was living in Key West, Florida. He claimed he was mugged in Colorado Springs and developed amnesia, which had worsened due to the concussion that he had suffered the month before he disappeared. Craig could not remember much else from the attack, claiming that he woke up in a hospital with the name Ron. He also claimed that he wandered aimlessly throughout the United States before arriving in the Key West, where he found a job as a diver. Craig soon contacted Christine along with his ex-wife. Unfortunately, he did not remember Christine or his family. Nevertheless, Christine and Craig were reunited a few days later. The two later traveled to Colorado Springs, hoping that something would jog his memory. However, the trip was unsuccessful. They decided to divorce but remained friends. Craig moved to California to stay with friends, while Christine moved to Wyoming to start a new life. Despite Craig's claims, investigators are still suspicious of his amnesia and believed that he staged his disappearance. They believe he ran away to escape debts and the responsibilities of running his new business. Do please let me know what your thoughts are about this case down below in the comments section. Jack Donald Lewis. Jack Donald Lewis, known to many as Don, was a beloved figure and an influential businessman in the exotic animal industry. His passion for wildlife, particularly big cats, and his entrepreneurial spirit helped him build a thriving business, Wildlife on Easy Street, in Tampa, Florida. He was well regarded for his deep connection to wildlife and his expertise in the care and preservation of exotic animals, particularly tigers and other big cats. His savvy and real estate also played a major role in his success, adding another layer to his already impressive legacy. But on August 18, 1997, Don's life was abruptly interrupted when he mysteriously disappeared. His sudden vanishing sparked a widespread investigation, but over the years, the case remained unsolved, leaving his friends, family, and fans searching for answers. Despite the substantial evidence that came to light, including suspicions surrounding his personal life and business dealings, nothing definitive was found to explain his disappearance. Don's case continues to be a source of intrigue and speculation, particularly with the emergence of new theories and claims in recent years. His disappearance remains one of the most perplexing unsolved mysteries in Florida's history, and the questions surrounding what happened to him are as unanswered as they were in 1997. As investigators continue to sift through evidence and revisit old leads, the mystery of Don Lewis' fate remains one of the most baffling and unresolved in the world of true crime. In Don's early years as a child, his father abandoned the family and left Don's mother to raise him and his two siblings. While Don's mother did her best to support her children through freelance gigs as a for-hire seamstress and bread baker, her income wasn't quite enough. Thus, to help aid his mother and take care of the family, started working at a young age, forming the foundation to his business ethics. As an adolescent, Don helped out a local mechanic and worked as a farmhand for nearby ranch owners, and successfully graduated from Pasco High School in 1955. When he was only 17 years old, Don married his first wife, known today as Gladys Lewis Cross. Together, the couple had 3 daughters and adopted a son, just as Don continued to expand his economic prowess. He worked countless odd jobs around Florida and eventually settled in the used car business and automotive trade. Slowly but surely, Don built his brand scrapping old machines, selling parts and metal resources while simultaneously investing in real estate opportunities. Don would buy parcels of land to develop and resell, sometimes keeping tracts of land for himself for future business ideas. Before long, Don was a self-made millionaire and the prime example of the American dream in action, starting from nothing and forging his own path to success. Friends and associates of Dom would say that no one could tell his success just by looking at him. He always dressed like a normal laborer and kept his public life simple. However, he would keep a $500 bill in his pocket at all times, a symbol of his ability to turn anything he touched into profits, a true green thumb. However, Don's personal life wasn't quite so perfect. It was a well-known fact after his first marriage that he was a womanizer and often found mistresses or second girlfriends to take care of despite having the family back home. One such instance occurred in 1981, when Don met a young woman named Carol Murdoch at the time on Nebraska Avenue in Tampa, Florida. Carol was walking alone at night and crying after struggling with her then-husband, Michael Murdoch. Don asked Carol if she needed a ride, and initially Carol rejected him. However, Don circled around in his truck anyway, even offering the gun in his passenger seat to Carol to use as protection while he drove, explaining that he needed someone to talk to as well. Carol finally agreed, and after conversing with one another for a while, Carol stayed with him that night, and the two fell in love. Of course, this sent shock waves through Don's family, and tensions arose between him and his then-wife, Gladys. Nevertheless, continued his relationship with Carol, who joined his real estate business and helped increase his profits through major land sales. Not long afterwards, Don and Carol's relationship became too serious to ignore, and they divorced their respective spouses and married in 1991. With the excess money from Don's empire, he brought his new cat-loving wife, a bobcat called Windsong, at an auction. The couple then began buying big cats from a breeder in Minnesota who was planning on slaughtering them for the fur trade. As was perhaps in his nature, viewed this as another chance to create a business, and in 1992, founded Wildlife on Easy Street with Carol and what would later become Big Cat Rescue. Carol, however, thought the initiative should be a charity and not just for profit. But Don disagreed, and slowly tensions arose between the two. Over the next few years, Don continued developing Wildlife on Easy Streets and started buying more animals. In 1995, he bought his first tiger from Dennis Hall, and around the same time was beginning the process of taking his beloved emporium and moving it to Costa Rica, where he'd been buying vast tracts of lands and making connections and associates on the tropical island. At the same time, others began thinking that Don was using Costa Rica as a means to attract women unbeknownst to Carol and escaping away with Costa Rican mistresses. This continued to damage the pair's relationship, and soon it fell beyond repair. In early 1997, Don Lewis began preparing for divorce, gathering his assets together and planning for a future away from Carol. Carol claims that at this same time, he began showing early signs of dementia, his short-term memory declining while digging through dumpsters and collecting junk for seemingly no good reason. Don's lawyer and business associates later said this wasn't proven, and they had never witnessed Don in a worsening state of mind. Regardless, Don's frantic behavior did include a growing fear of Carol, and in June of 1997, he filed a restraining order against her after she verbally threatened to kill him. According to Don, Carol was in possession of multiple guns, but the courts never granted him protection due to her freedoms of speech under the First Amendment, and they felt she posed no true physical harm to him. Don was a worried man, and soon his paranoia was proven correct when at the end of that same summer, the threats, confusion, and anxiety gave way to a tragic mystery. Let us now review the timeline of events that led to the disappearance of Don Lewis. In June of 1997, Don Lewis begins exhibiting signs of paranoia, anxiety, and fear centering around his then-wife Carol Lewis, now known as Carol Baskin. He gives his executive assistant at the time, and the Queen, an envelope containing a restraining order against Carol to be submitted to the local courts. This document contains unnerving quotes by Don, such as, quote, "This is the second time Carol has gotten angry enough to threaten to kill me. Carol got in a big fuss. She ordered me out the house or she would kill me. She has a .45 revolver and she took my .357 and hid it." Later that June, the Florida courts denied protection from the restraining order, saying Carol is no immediate threat and that the First Amendment granting free speech allows her to say such things without consequence. Throughout the summer, Don's erratic behavior continues. He tells his former wife, Gladys, and a couple of their children to stay away from Carol, that he's done with her and planning to divorce her. He speaks his final words to them, saying Carol is one of the worst people and quite dangerous. Not long after this encounter, repeats the same information about his probable divorce-to-business associate, Wendell Williams. Don signals to Wendell that he is putting most of his possessions in a protective state that would allow him to keep most of what he owned and away from a settlement. Sometime in July of 1997, Don gets together with another friend, Mike McCarthy, tells him that he feels his life is in danger. As July turns to August, Don informs his lawyer, Joseph Fritz, he's in search of another small passenger plane to add to his collection of planes. He finds one he likes, but the aircraft needs work to be able to fly for longer durations of time. At some point during the first 2.5 weeks of that same August, Don has a conversation with his longtime handyman of 15 years, Kenny Farr, while they build a new complex cage for the big cats. Don remarks that he has vague plans of some sorts, plans he never fully explains to Kenny, but is intent on carrying out. At the end of their talk, Don says, quote, "If I can pull this off, it will have been the slickest thing I've ever done in my life." Before Kenny can ask for clarity, Don leaves to attend a phone call and never finishes his thoughts. It would be the last thing Don ever says to Kenny. On Friday, August 15th, Don's assistant and McQueen calls Don regarding paperwork for cars he's preparing to take down to Costa Rica. Despite multiple attempts to reach him by phone and isn't able to make contact, and continues calling throughout that weekend. But she still has no luck. In the evening of August 17th, Don prepares to drive down to Miami and then travel on to Costa Rica. He tells Carol he needs a truck made available for travel by his handyman Kenny, but it's unknown if he ever secures one. That night and into the early morning hours of August 18th, Carol makes her own plans to do chores and run errands for the Big Cat Resort. At around 3 a.m., Carol goes to a shop called Albertsons to buy milk byproduct for the cats. Her car breaks down, but she's saved by her brother, a local sheriff's deputy, who gives her a ride back to her home. Just a few hours later, a little prior to 6 a.m. on August 18, 1997, Don Lewis leaves his house to make an early delivery of real estate paperwork to his lawyer's main office, and then to travel to Miami and ultimately Costa Rica. This would be the last confirmed sighting of Jack Donald Lewis. Nearly 36 hours pass by, and no one hears from Don, and calls Carol with real concern and suggests they get the authorities involved. Carol agrees, and at about 1:30 p.m. on August 19th, she telephones law enforcement to officially report Don Lewis as a missing person. In the first 24 hours after the missing persons report is filed, police and a few volunteers combed Don's entire 40-acre property in Tampa, Florida, including the wildlife on Easy Street resorts. Despite a thorough search, including aerial support, detectives find no clues or anything to suggest they should continue digging at Don's residence. On August 20th, the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office discovers Don's personal van, a 1989 Dodge Ram, parked and abandoned at the Pilots Country Airport in Spring Hill, Florida, about 40 miles away from Don's last appearance at his animal sanctuary. Besides the keys to the van and a briefcase full of insignificant documents, nothing of note is found inside the vehicle, and the trail of clues is frozen once again. Over the next 4 to 5 days, detectives travel down to Costa Rica to progress the manhunt. While investigating every nook and cranny possible, law enforcement discovers Don had been engaged in extramarital affairs whilst in Costa Rica. They interview possible connections to Don and those who knew of the businessman, but still find zero leads. The only thing remarkable that investigators learn is that 2 of Don's exotic animals, a pair of ocelots, were shipped out just before Don disappeared, but where they went is still unknown. Initial reports once Don's disappearance reaches national headlines state that they believe Don probably walked away on his own, but as time goes on, both the media and investigators start thinking something more sinister is at play. A few days after the 1-year anniversary of Don's vanishing on August 23, 1998, refuses to take a polygraph test or allow investigators to carry out an intensive search of her wildlife sanctuary or the meat freezers, citing legal advice from her attorney. Later in 1998, Don Lewis' ex-wife, Gladys, and their daughters publicly accuse Carol of being responsible for Don's fate and discarding the body via the exotic animals they own. This is heavily refuted by Carol. In August 2002, on the 5-year and 1-day mark since he first disappeared, Don is declared legally dead by Carol, and his wills are put solely in her possession due to the specific verbiage used in his documents. 9 years later, in 2011, Carol is asked one more time by investigators to undergo a polygraph test. Once again, she refuses this request. Over the next decade, countless conspiracies and folktales are created by curious bystanders of the case and by those with ties to Don, his ex-wife Carol, and their big cat business. However, John Mariscano, the lead homicide detective and spokesman of the investigation for Hillsborough County Sheriff, has shot down any and all gossip in April of 2020, stating that authorities have no prime suspects, no leads, and still no updates regarding the disappearance of Don Lewis. A case just as cold as it had been in that early August morning 23 years before. Not a lot of physical evidence remains in the Don Lewis disappearance, and without a final phone call recording leftover or CCTV footage capturing Don's penultimate movements, there's not much to run with. However, one discovery does provide us at least a hint of what happened to Don before he vanished, even if it does bring more confusion than clarity. The day after Don was reported missing, investigators discovered his 1989 Dodge Ram van discarded at the Pilot Country Airport in Spring Hill, Florida. The airport was about 40 miles, give or take, from Don's personal residence, and initially thought to be where he flew out of that August morning. The troubling thing was that almost nothing was left behind in the van, and the things that were did not preclude a self-made decision to escape. Inside were the van's keys and Don's briefcase full of random papers. Unfortunately, the police did not impound the vehicle right away, leaving it abandoned in that parking lot, allowing for possible tampering and for critical physical evidence to be removed if there was something hidden on the atomic level. When the police did analyze the forensics, they found nothing but normal traces of Don and a second pair of fingerprints belonging to an auto mechanic, Dale Lively. When law enforcement interviewed Dale, he gave proof of a perfectly innocent explanation, stating a few days before the disappearance, Don had swung by the shop and asked Dale to work on the van. During their interaction, Don also asked Dale to come with him to Costa Rica to help on his land, further indicating that Don was fully committed to a southward trip. Dale declined, and the van situation became just another dead end in a case full of questions without answers. Many people associated with the case believe the van is a sign that Don was kidnapped and not a sign that he left on his own accord. Detectives agree, thinking the van was planted at the airport either to simply get rid of it or to make investigators think it was Don's final stop. Regardless, the amount of time it took authorities to analyze the insides of the van for forensics creates a massive what-if in the search for Don, and it is sadly the biggest clue they've received to date, one which may have been regrettably squandered. With the facts of the case understood, now let's turn to the dominant theories in the case of the disappearance of Don Lewis. Like so many cold cases around the world, the disappearance of Don Lewis has been the fodder for some truly outlandish claims and conspiracies sparked by both family members and those with disdain for Don's former partners. Sadly, these brash and borderline barbaric theories have been glamorized and focused on by one particular documentary series and its ensuing publicity. So we will do our best to dissect each theory with clarity and reasoning backed by evidence to properly respect the facts of the case and the man who went missing. It's our belief that truth and respect to the facts of the case should always take precedence, and it is insulting to Don Lewis's memory and potentially damaging to his case to sacrifice these in the pursuit of an overdramatized quote-unquote good story. The first real theory purported by those involved with Don Lewis's personal life came from his daughters and his first ex-wife, Gladys Lewis Cross, in 1998, only 1 year after Don went missing. They made a public interview in People magazine, theorizing that Carol Baskin had indeed killed Don, and then disposed of his body via a meat grinder, and then feeding it to her tigers at the Big Cat Rescue Sanctuary. Daughters felt the police didn't do a thorough enough job searching the property and should have carried out forensic analysis on Carol's meat grinder, testing it for Don's DNA. Carol has vehemently denied such possibilities, claiming the meat grinder in question was too small to even handle something like a human hand, let alone an entire full-grown adult male body. Not only this, but what many people fail to realize and what one documentary fails to make widely known is that the meat grinder in question was removed from the Big Cat Rescue weeks before Don went missing, confirmed by the sheriff's office investigating Don's case. And if Carol did try to use a corpse as food for her big cats, there's absolutely no way bones and forensic evidence would not be left behind. The acidity of a tiger's stomach is strong, but not strong enough to completely destroy human remains. There would be a significant amount of bones, blood, and tissue left over, and to try to clean up every bit of the leftovers and leave absolutely no hints of the act is too far-fetched to believe. Such a vile act, even if utilized, would leave behind too much evidence, and investigators certainly would have picked up on something. Nevertheless, these outlandish claims have only picked up steam when notorious big cat collector and nemesis of Carole Baskin, Joe Exotic, created an obscene music video flaunting the tiger-feeding hypothesis. But that wasn't his only crazy claim. Joe Exotic became obsessed with another theory that while Carole was still responsible for her husband's disappearance, she actually hid his body under the ground at Big Cat Rescue, digging up the dirt where her septic tank rested, and putting Don's body in that, covering it up, and pretending as if nothing had happened. Joe made many public pleas for investigators to excavate the earth around the property and check the septic tank. And this idea spread around his own exotic zoo where employees began believing that same conclusion. However, the documentaries covering Joe and his theories also failed to share the information that debunks his theory as well. The septic tank in question, in a similar vein to the meat grinder, was not installed on the Big Cat Rescue Sanctuary until multiple years after Don went missing. If Don was buried somewhere on the property, it was nowhere near the septic tank. In addition, it makes little sense for Carole to bury Don on her own property, where future digs and construction work will almost assuredly take place and risk discovery. Now, all this being said, to completely remove Carole Baskin as a suspect would be premature. While she has consistently denied any involvement, there are pieces to her past that might suggest a motive, or at least further consideration. The major piece of the case that might preclude motivation for Carole is Don's promiscuity and overall stance on the wildlife projects he and Carole had created. It is well known that Don saw the tigers and various big cats as nothing more than a business, and thought of it as a means to make money rather than any real charity. While they were initially together in that viewpoint, eventually wanted the sanctuary to be exactly that, a place where rescued cats could live approved by fellow activists, saving them from immoral breeding and cub abuse. This requires a lot of money, and Carole had Don to fall back on. Some in Don's inner circle said he hated losing his money to her spending, and that being a millionaire married to someone without much money is a treacherous combination. But we mustn't pretend that Don was perfect either. He was also involved in various extramarital affairs, having multiple girlfriends despite his marriage to including a secret mistress down in Costa Rica. With a clashing philosophy and a dying marriage, Carole may have sought to end what was becoming a toxic situation. In fact, pages from her personal diaries exposed by various sources found entries written by Carole stating things such as, "I wish there was some way out of her relationship with Don," not to mention her verbal threats. Eventually, her wish was granted, and most suspiciously of all, Carole Baskin did end up the biggest beneficiary of Don's vanishing. Not long after he went missing, Carole cut off all the utilities to Don's office, took out his wills and powers of attorney, and held onto them until the very first date she was allowed to declare him legally dead, the 5-year and 1-day anniversary of his disappearance. Even stranger was that when the powers of attorney were read, lawyers found that a special clause had been written granting Carole head of Don's estates, not after his death, but specifically after his disappearance. Multiple lawyers have said this is an irregular clause for such legal documents, as people rarely expect to disappear. Not only that, but Carole ended up inheriting 90% of Don's worth, leaving just 10% behind for Don's former family. Now it should be stated that Don had instructed Carole to leave them with 0%, that she decided to help them regardless, citing their blood relationship to Don as meaningful. Does the strange disappearance clause in Don's will, combined with his infidelity and strict business-minded pursuits, make Carole the killer? No. But it does raise suspicion in her motivations as $1 million were at stake to keep her dream of saving big cats alive. Some have pointed out that just because she had Don legally declared dead the first day possible doesn't mean she was the mastermind either. And they have a point. Wouldn't it be ridiculously obvious to carry out such a suspicious legal action? If Carole was indeed at fault, drawing attention to the matter wouldn't be her priority. It's also possible that she wasn't the killer, but rather had blood on her hands, arranging for someone else to handle Don. It is undoubtedly deeply suspicious. There are many people afraid of Carole, including Don himself, but fear, circumstantial evidence, and speculation unfortunately does not mean the party is guilty without physical evidence. Of course, Carole Baskin isn't the only one subject to theories of involvement. In fact, many people wonder if Don wasn't involved with anything malicious or any third party at all, but rather left on his own accord or died trying to do so. With his vast resources and $1 million, Don certainly had the capital necessary to pull off a stunt and escape his previous life. Perhaps he was done with the big cat operation and the hassle of dealing with such a consuming business. Perhaps his affairs with women were catching up with him and he wanted to start over. Or perhaps he was truly fearful of Carol and set up his estates so she would profit over his disappearance while he got to start over on the far side of the world. These theorists believe Don faked a kidnapping, fully intending to fly out of Miami that August morning and never return. He could have put his van in a different airport parking lot to throw police off his trail, hopped on another flight, and vanished in the blink of an eye. It's not out of the realm of possibility that Don had money outside of his known estate or was saving up for this exact scenario. Don was full of secrets and constantly plotting his next move, preparing for the future better than most. In fact, Don's personal handyman, Kenny Farr, told reporters he knew Don would bury money in gold bars around his various properties and was probably worth around $20 million, $15 million more than his lawyers thought. Remember that Kenny was the person Don told, quote, "If I can pull this off, it will be the slickest thing I've ever done in my life." Could it have been a great escape plan? Many think it to be possible, but not Kenny. He doesn't understand why Don would leave a van at an airport at all, even if it wasn't the right one. It would be too big a clue that Don was running away and make it much harder to become invisible. Both Don's lawyer, Joseph Fritz, and lead investigator of Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office, John Marcicano, agree, saying Don was more likely to have been killed. The other arguments that Don left on his own will, but perished unexpectedly, is also heavily gossiped. Some followers of the case, including Carol Baskin herself, think that Don may have got into one of his planes to fly to Costa Rica, but crashed somewhere in the ocean. There is, however, a lot of evidence to suggest this is false. Detective Marciano points to the lack of flight records going to Costa Rica that day and the lack of crash reports in the area for the same timeline. Theorists then report that Don was a known illegal flyer, having lost his pilot's license, but choosing to fly anyway, operating his planes low and under radar detection. Yet again, Detective Marciano refutes these claims, saying every plane Don owned was far too small to make the trip to Costa Rica in one go. If Don did get in a plane and attempt to travel south, it would have been desperate and unsafe, possibly hinting at a deteriorating state of mind that some have claimed that Don was suffering from before he disappeared. As previously noted, Don was experiencing symptoms of onset dementia and may have been overcome with fatigue, paranoia, or a combination of the two. This would explain his ramblings to his friends about being in fear for his life and constantly looking over his shoulder, conspiring against his then-wife, Carol. The problem with this theory, though, is that if Don was truly dealing with memory loss and dementia, he would not be able to successfully vanish without a trace so easily. If his mental faculties were becoming compromised, surely he would have made a mistake somewhere. Plus, a lot of close associates to Don don't believe the dementia stories anyway, saying he was of sound mind and honestly genuinely terrified for his life. So if it doesn't appear that Carol killed Don, and it wasn't Don who left by choice, who was responsible for his disappearance? A few people think Joe Exotic was actually the one to blame, wondering if he may have taken Don out to spite Carol and derailed the future of wildlife on Easy Street, claiming the validity in such a conspiracy, knowing John was guilty of other plots against Carol's life. However, it should be noted that Joe and Carol's bitter rivalry did not exist in 1997, and no such evidence supports this idea. A few others point to militant animal rights activists or think that Don had connections to drug lords in South America that wanted him dead. Regardless, the fact of the matter is the police have no hard evidence and have no prime suspects in their sights. Anyone could be at fault, and that's what makes Don Lewis' disappearance all the more tragic. Before we divulge our hypothesis of Don Lewis' unsolved disappearance, we want to make it known that our conclusions are purely logical speculation based on evidence, circumstance, and factual subtext. We are only privy to the same information presented in each video, and we do not promise certainty or an expert guarantee on the findings we reach in closing. We simply observe, research, and report. In the case of Don Lewis, we believe he was kidnapped, murdered, or a combination of the two. So many of the people involved with Don in his life, such as business associates, family members, his personal lawyer, and the lead investigators looking for him, believe the same to be true, that somebody or somebody's wanted Don dead, whether it be for vengeance, spite, or pure malice. The tricky part of the equation is who. Without a doubt, Don Lewis's killer was both close to him and had the resources to carry out a seamless homicide. The perpetrator had to be close to Don to know of his planned trips to Costa Rica and multiple projects down there, and be able to use that as a blind for investigators, tricking people into thinking he disappeared purposefully. Now, this doesn't necessarily trim down the list of suspects because Don had a lot of friends and a lot of enemies, each of whom knew of his Costa Rica paradise. Yet it does signal the killer was smart and knew how to arrange a multifaceted kidnapping. In addition to smarts, the killer had to have the money to hire someone to get rid of Don or to do it themselves without ever leaving so much as a hair follicle. In the case of a multimillionaire like Don was, removing them from the face of the earth is going to take a pretty penny. So how did they do it? A lot is left to be desired in the investigation in terms of clues and concrete timelines, but if the killer was an associate to Don, they probably had secretly arranged a meeting early that August 18th morning with him. He was already out to make a delivery and head to Miami for a flight. So the arrangement was probably just another stop. It was here they likely kidnapped him, drove his van to the airport as a fake out, and disposed of him elsewhere. There's also the idea that Don could be meeting someone with his own planes, and when they took off, he was pushed out over the ocean by his murderer, a theory brought up by his lawyer. Whatever the method was, it ended with a clean getaway. Could it have been Carol Baskin? It is entirely possible. In addition to the theories mentioned previously, Carol's own family had a disdain for Don. And speaking of her family, she also had a brother as a deputy in the sheriff's office, who was one of the last people to be around Don right before he went missing. Plenty of people have come forward to quickly strike down theories of collusion in law enforcement, or any involvement from Carol's brother, citing their weak relationship to begin with. Both Carol and Ann McQueen, the assistant who probably knew Don Lewis better than he knew himself, were intensely vetted by detectives, cleared of any wrongdoing, and never labeled as prime suspects. It doesn't rule them out completely, but it does give credence to the fact there is simply no lead at the forefront of the investigation. It's important to remember that at the center of the entire case is a man whose fate is unknown, the humanity and tragedy of which is sometimes obscured by the glorification of conspiracy theories and internet jokes. There are loved ones and friends of Don Lewis who are desperate for answers and longing to know what happened to him, but instead of receiving real help, they have to wake up every day to see his face and name abused by people looking to profit off his mystery and laughing at the idea that he was fed to tigers. It is so important to remember that the people in these cases were people, real people who deserve respect and justice. And the abuse of their stories to make shocking headlines and quick money is insidious. Was Don Lewis a perfect man? No, by no stretch of the imagination. He, like all of us, had his issues and shortcomings. But at the end of the day, Don Lewis was a real person with a beating heart and deserved to live out the rest of his days. No matter how badly someone didn't like him or the businesses he involved himself with. Because of the tone and reception of certain documentaries made since Don disappeared, it is hard to get people to focus on finding answers rather than supporting the nonsense. So it is up to all of us to work to progress above the overly dramatized conspiracy theories, looking to shock viewers and readers to earn quick money and humanize Jack Donald Lewis and respect his case. If you or anyone you know has any information that could assist investigators in the search for Jack Donald Lewis, please contact the relevant authorities. No detail is too small or insignificant, as it could hold the key to unraveling the chilling mystery of Don Lewis and the legacy he left behind at Wildlife on Easy Street.